Tonight we follow the Nile backward through time into a world older than memory, where black river mud clings to bare feet and the night sky hangs over the desert like cold blue stone. The air smells faintly of wet reeds and smoke from cooking fires. Somewhere nearby, a dog barks once and then falls silent. Water moves softly against the riverbank. You stand there in darkness beside people who have no pyramids yet, no pharaohs, no famous monuments rising into the desert. Only the river, only survival. The Nile already controls everything. You feel it before you understand it. The river floods, retreats, and leaves rich soil behind like a gift that arrives on its own strange schedule. Villagers gather cautiously beside its edges. Mud brick homes lean together under the heat. Fish dry on woven racks. Children carry jars heavier than their thin arms prefer. A woman grinds grain with slow patience while flies drift lazily through afternoon light. Nothing here feels ancient to the people living it. To them, this is simply life. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel inclined tonight, share your location, your local time, and the part of history you return to most often when the world grows loud and exhausting. The river people would probably understand that feeling better than expected. You walk among them quietly. Sand presses softly beneath your sandals. The evenings cool faster than you imagine. During daylight hours, heat settles over everything with astonishing weight, but night along the Nile can feel almost gentle. You hear frogs calling through reeds. You smell damp earth after floodwater retreats. A fisherman repairs a torn net beside a flickering oil flame while his daughter sleeps nearby against bundled straw. Already, death feels close here. Not dramatic death, not legendary death. Ordinary death. A fever during flood season. A snake hidden near water jars. A child weakened by hunger after poor harvests. The river gives constantly, but it also takes without explanation. These people learn early that survival depends upon preparation, cooperation, and ritual. Even before written language spreads widely, symbols begin gathering meaning, patterns repeat, burials become more careful. At first, bodies rest in shallow desert graves. The sand itself performs an accidental miracle. Dry heat preserves skin and hair naturally. Families notice this. They notice that the dead sometimes remain strangely recognizable beneath the earth. A face survives longer than expected. Fingers remain curled exactly as they were placed. The desert keeps secrets carefully. That realization changes something profound inside the human imagination. You sit beside a small burial sometime near sunset. The mourners are quiet rather than theatrical. A woven mat covers the body. Simple pottery rests nearby containing beer and grain. Someone places a necklace beside the dead woman almost shyly, as though embarrassed by hope itself. There are no grand speeches, no polished theology yet, only instinct. Maybe she still needs these things. Maybe some part of her continues. The thought arrives softly, but once it appears, it never fully leaves Egyptian civilization again. Nearby, floodwater glimmers beneath moonlight. The Nile feels alive at night, not metaphorically alive, truly alive. You understand why ancient people imagined spirits inside natural forces. The river changes shape constantly. Channels shift, islands vanish. Crocodiles slide silently through black water with ancient eyes barely visible above the surface. Fear and gratitude become tangled together. That emotional mixture shapes Egypt from the beginning. In these early settlements, leaders emerge gradually. Some organize irrigation, some settle disputes, some simply possess stronger personalities than others. Power begins humbly before it becomes divine. You notice how carefully people observe the skies. Seasons matter desperately now. Timing determines survival. A delayed flood can become catastrophe. And still, life continues with surprising tenderness. A mother braids her son's hair outside a mudhouse while bread bakes nearby on hot stone. Two brothers joke quietly while carrying water jars from the riverbank. An elderly man hums through missing teeth while carving wood handles for farming tools. Human beings remain human even inside history textbooks that later flatten them into abstractions. You begin noticing another pattern too. The dead are never entirely absent. Families speak about them naturally. Graves remain close to daily life rather than hidden far away. Memory occupies physical space. Names matter deeply. To disappear completely after death feels unbearable, even now. Before pyramids and royal tombs dominate the horizon, emotional groundwork already exists for everything that will come later. Egyptian civilization does not invent its obsession with death suddenly. It grows slowly from love. That detail matters. Many centuries from now, outsiders will stare at mummies with fascination or discomfort. They will imagine curses, treasure chambers, and strange rituals illuminated by torchlight. But here, in these early villages beside the Nile, the emotional core remains heartbreakingly simple. People cannot bear losing one another completely, so they preserve, they remember, they prepare. The wind shifts softly across the riverbank tonight. You smell fish oil, mud, and smoke drifting together beneath stars untouched by modern light. Somewhere in the darkness, musicians play a reed flute with slow, uneven notes. The sound carries farther than expected over water. A few villagers clap gently in rhythm, others simply listen. History rarely begins with kings. It begins with exhausted people trying to create stability before the next flood arrives. You walk farther south along the Nile and see how villages differ slightly from one another. Some trade stone tools, others produce stronger pottery or cultivate richer farmland. Rivalries already exist. Cooperation does too. Boats move carefully along the river carrying grain, baskets, and gossip between settlements. The Nile acts like a long living road connecting distant strangers. Without it, none of this survives. And without death, none of this develops its strange emotional depth. A young boy asks his father why birds disappear into the western horizon each evening. The father answers casually while repairing fishing hooks. The West becomes associated with endings because the sun dies there every night. Later, entire necropolises will rise on western shores. Tombs will face symbolic landscapes shaped partly by moments exactly like this one, small observations becoming eternal traditions. You pause beside another grave before dawn arrives. This one belongs to a child. The burial is painfully modest. A tiny clay figure rests beside the wrapped body. Someone has placed flowers there recently. They're already drying beneath desert air. Grief survives thousands of years remarkably well. You feel it standing here, not as spectacle, as intimacy. The first pale light begins spreading across the eastern horizon now. Birds stir within reeds along the water. Labourers wake slowly inside clustered homes. Another day beside the Nile begins exactly as countless others have before it, yet something important has already taken root inside these communities. The belief that human life deserves continuation. Soon that belief will reshape landscapes, governments, architecture, religion, and memory itself. Entire kingdoms will rise from it. Pharaohs will command mountains of stone into geometric perfection, because ordinary people once buried loved ones carefully beneath warm desert sand. But for now, morning remains quiet. The river moves steadily north, and you stand listening beside the beginning of Egypt. Morning light spreads across the Nile in long bands of pale gold, and the river already feels busier than it did during the night. Boats drift through thin mist carrying baskets of onions, fish wrapped in reeds, and men half asleep from early labour. The smell of damp mud rises warmly beneath the sun. Somewhere ahead, A donkey complains loudly while children laugh at its misery with the easy cruelty reserved for stubborn animals. You continue north beside a civilization beginning to organize itself into something larger than scattered villages. The changes happen slowly enough that most people barely notice them at first. A local leader demands grain storage near flood season. Another claims authority over nearby farmland. Families start identifying themselves through regional loyalties. Symbols painted onto pottery repeat more often. Standards appear during ceremonies. Small conflicts erupt over irrigation channels and fishing territories. Then the conflicts grow larger. Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north develop distinct identities over generations. Different crowns emerge, different traditions, different rulers, yet the Nile binds them together despite rivalry, carrying trade and ambition along the same narrow ribbon of fertile land. You stand among a gathering crowd near a riverside settlement where men speak anxiously about war upriver. Not endless war. Not yet. Mostly raids and territorial disputes. But people already understand what organized violence can accomplish. Spears lean beside doorways now. Young men train together in dusty courtyards, while older women watch with expressions caught somewhere between pride and dread. Power changes human posture. You can see it happening. The leaders of these growing territories no longer behave like respected village elders. They surround themselves with attendants. Ceremonies become more elaborate. Certain individuals eat better food and wear finer linen. Gold ornaments appear more frequently among elites. The gap between ordinary survival and sacred authority widens one careful step at a time. And still the Nile floods on schedule. Indifferent to political ambition, you travel southward into Upper Egypt where dry cliffs rise sharply beyond green farmland. Heat presses against your skin by midday. Workers pause beneath woven shade structures drinking beer diluted with water. It tastes sour and thick, but safer than river water during the hottest months. Here, one ruler gradually gains strength beyond the others. Historians still debate details surrounding this period. Names blur together through incomplete records and later mythology. But many believe a king called Nama, perhaps the same ruler later remembered as Menes, unites Upper and Lower Egypt sometime around 3100 BCE. The achievement will echo for thousands of years. You witness celebration mixed uneasily with fear. Victorious soldiers return wearing dust, sweat, and dried blood along leather grips. Captured standards hang upside down in public view. Priests burn incense near newly raised ceremonial objects, while officials record tribute deliveries with careful concentration. A united Egypt sounds glorious in hindsight. Living through it feels more uncertain. One old fisherman mutters quietly that kings always promise stability before demanding taxes. His daughter tells him to lower his voice. Nearby soldiers are drinking. He shrugs and spits into the river anyway. Human skepticism survives every age. The new pharaoh presents himself as more than political leader now. He becomes intermediary between humanity and divine order. That transformation matters deeply because Egypt depends upon stability more than many civilizations ever will. Flood cycles require coordination. Irrigation demands cooperation. Chaos threatens starvation frighteningly fast. So order becomes sacred. You begin hearing a word repeated more often by priests and officials: Ma'at, balance, harmony, cosmic order, truth. The concept stretches beyond simple translation. Egyptians believe existence itself depends upon maintaining proper balance between forces. The pharaoh does not merely govern people, he protects reality from collapse into disorder. Without rightful rule, the Nile could fail, crops could die, society could fracture into violence and famine. That belief gives royal authority enormous emotional weight. You attend a ceremony inside an early temple courtyard, where incense smoke curls slowly toward painted rafters. Musicians play drums with hypnotic steadiness, while priests move through rehearsed gestures perfected across generations. The ruler appears wearing symbolic crowns representing both Upper and Lower Egypt together. The crowd kneels almost instantly. Not everyone kneels from devotion. Some kneel from habit, some from fear, some because refusing would attract dangerous attention. Yet many genuinely want to believe someone stands between civilization and catastrophe. After centuries of uncertainty, unity feels comforting, even divine. You notice how carefully public imagery develops around kingship now. Massive figures carved onto ceremonial palettes tower over enemies. The pharaoh appears calm while striking defeated rivals. Power becomes theatrical long before theatre formally exists. Rulers understand symbolism instinctively. People obey stories as much as armies. Meanwhile, ordinary life continues beneath political transformation. Farmers still wake before dawn. Bakers still sweat beside clay ovens. Midwives still comfort frightened mothers through difficult births while dogs bark outside narrow streets. History's grand transitions unfold around people too busy surviving to admire them properly. A young scribe sits cross-legged beside a storage room carefully practicing symbols onto broken pottery shards. Writing itself remains relatively new and astonishing. At first, records mostly track grain, taxes, livestock, labour. Administrative necessity drives literacy before literature flourishes, but something profound changes once language becomes visible. Words survive their speakers. Names endure beyond death. The Egyptians understand this almost immediately. You watch a grieving husband trace his dead wife's name carefully into wet clay beside her burial offerings. The gesture feels intimate enough to disturb you slightly. He's trying to preserve her through language itself. Already the connection between writing, memory, and immortality grows stronger. That thread will eventually lead directly toward funerary texts and the Book of the Dead, but not yet. For now, Egypt learns how to exist as one kingdom stretched along the river's narrow spine. Travel becomes safer in many regions under centralized authority. Trade expands, craftsmen specialize further. Quarries produce stone for increasingly ambitious projects. Officials monitor harvests and labor obligations with exhausting precision. Organization spreads everywhere. You spend one evening inside a crowded riverside home during flood season. Rain rarely falls here, yet moisture hangs heavily in the air tonight. Relatives gather for a shared meal while oil lamps flicker against mud walls darkened by smoke. An elderly grandmother tells stories about earlier times before unification. She speaks about raids, about hunger, about villages burned near disputed canals. The younger listeners seem fascinated rather than traumatized. Stability arrives gradually enough that memory of chaos already feels distant to them. That may be the greatest victory early pharaohs achieve. They convince people unified Egypt has always existed. Successful states often rewrite emotional memory itself. Outside, frogs call loudly beside floodwater channels. You smell wet reeds and fresh bread cooling near open windows. A baby sleeps through the noise entirely. One tiny fist curled against his cheek. You wonder whether his descendants will someday help build pyramids. The idea sounds impossible from here. Egypt still feels fragile despite growing power. Disease spreads quickly in crowded settlements. Crop failures remain dangerous. Regional tensions never disappear entirely. Yet confidence has undeniably emerged. Leaders think beyond immediate survival now. They imagine permanence. That shift changes architecture first. Royal tombs grow larger and more carefully constructed. Burial goods become increasingly elaborate. Servants and retainers sometimes accompany rulers into death itself during early dynastic periods, sacrificed to continue serving beyond mortal life. The practice feels horrifyingly calm when witnessed directly. Priests conduct rituals with solemn precision. Families mourn publicly while officials maintain ceremonial order. The message underneath remains unmistakable. The ruler's importance transcends ordinary humanity. Death no longer ends service to the crown. night settles again across the Nile. Torches flicker along temple walls while insects drift through warm darkness. Somewhere distant, musicians continue playing slow, repetitive melodies older than written history. The United Kingdom breathes quietly around you now, still young enough to feel uncertain, yet powerful enough to dream beyond survival. And somewhere ahead in that dream, stone monuments already wait beneath the desert stars. The desert begins before you expect it. One moment the Nile Valley feels crowded with life, thick with reeds, birds, gardens, and voices. Then, only a short walk beyond cultivated land, the world opens into silence and stone. Sand stretches beneath a hard white sky. Heat trembles above the ground in wavering currents. Your sandals fill with dust almost immediately. And there, rising from the edge of that emptiness, stands something entirely new. Not a pyramid yet, Nzda. Not the smooth geometric mountains future generations will recognize instantly. This structure rises in stacked layers, broad and strange against the horizon, as though giant stone platforms were placed one upon another by careful hands. Workers swarm around it carrying limestone blocks beneath the relentless sun. Ramps climb its sides, hammering echoes faintly through dry air. You have arrived at Saqqara during the reign of King Djoser, and beside him, though history remembers pharaohs more easily than architects, stands one of the most remarkable minds in the ancient world, a man named Imhotep. Priest, administrator, builder, physician, perhaps, advisor certainly. The kind of person later generations struggled to categorize because his abilities seem impossibly broad. You walk among labourers hauling sledges across packed earth. Sweat darkens linen clothing. Men pour water before heavy loads so the sand grips less fiercely beneath wooden runners. Overseers shout instructions without much cruelty. Contrary to old fantasies, these workers are not chained slaves driven endlessly by whips. Most are labourers fulfilling state obligations or earning provisions during flood seasons when farming temporarily pauses. The work is still brutal. No romantic language changes that. You feel limestone dust coating your throat. The smell of sweat, wet rope, and sun-heated stone settles heavily in the air. Nearby, a worker massages his shoulders while quietly complaining that the king apparently intends to climb directly into the sky after death. His friend laughs without looking up. At least he won't ask us to carry the whole sky, too. Dry humus survives even beneath sacred architecture. The step pyramid complex expands around you like an enormous experiment. Earlier royal tombs, called mastabas, were flat rectangular structures built from mud brick. Imhotep changes everything by stacking mastabas upward into ascending layers of stone. Stone? That decision alone alters history permanently. Mud brick decays, stone endures. Egyptian rulers now begin building not merely for memory, but for eternity. You enter part of the surrounding complex where carved columns imitate bundled reeds and wooden structures from older traditions. Even in innovation, Egypt carries its past carefully forward. Sacred spaces smell faintly of incense, plaster dust, and hot mineral surfaces baking beneath daylight. Priests move through corridors rehearsing funerary rituals with a disciplined calm. Everything here revolves around death, yet the atmosphere feels strangely alive. Messengers hurry between officials. Craftsmen carve reliefs with astonishing precision. Bakers prepare food for workers nearby. Water carriers weave through crowded pathways, balancing heavy jars against their shoulders. A city gathers around the promise of immortality, and beneath that promise sits a very human fear. You hear it sometimes at night. Workers speaking quietly beside cooking fires after darkness cools the desert. They wonder what waits after death. They worry whether rituals truly matter. One young labourer admits he envies the king. At least priests remember his name. No one answers immediately. The crackling fire fills the silence instead. Memory has become a form of survival now. Royal tombs preserve not only bodies but identity itself. Images carved into walls continue feeding the dead symbolically. Offerings sustain them. Names spoken aloud grant endurance beyond physical decay. The Egyptian afterlife grows more detailed with each generation. You spend time observing embalmers working on elite burials near Saqqara. Techniques remain relatively early compared to later mummification practices, yet the intention is unmistakable. Bodies matter deeply. Preservation matters deeply. The dead must remain recognizable for eternity to function properly in the next world. One elderly embalmer handles a noblewoman's body with surprising gentleness. He smooths linen around her hands almost like a father tucking blankets around a sleeping child. Outside the workshop, desert wind carries fine sand against stone walls with soft scraping sounds. The sky turns copper beneath approaching evening. Workers descend from construction ramps slowly now, exhausted beyond speech. Some limp. Others sing quietly together while carrying tools homeward. The monument towers behind them, permanent, unyielding. You realize something important standing here. The pyramid is not only a tomb, it is a declaration. Egypt announces itself through architecture now. The kingdom possesses enough centralized power, labor organization, agricultural surplus, and spiritual confidence to build on a scale previously unimaginable. Stone transforms political authority into landscape itself. People living near Saqqara cannot ignore the king. Even the horizon belongs partly to him. Yet beneath this confidence lies anxiety too. Djoser's court understands how fragile order remains. Failed floods still threaten catastrophe. Regional loyalties still simmer beneath national unity. Building projects help reinforce stability psychologically. They create visible permanence in a world still vulnerable to chaos. You wander through nearby settlements where workers live with their families. Children chase one another through dusty lanes, while mothers repair torn linen in fading light. Bread ovens radiate lingering warmth into the evening air. A musician plays softly on a harp missing one string. Life around the pyramid feels ordinary in ways history rarely captures. A young couple argues quietly about grain rations. An old man complains about aching knees after hauling stone. A girl falls asleep beside unfinished pottery before her mother carries her gently indoors. Civilization always rests upon exhausted ordinary people. That truth never changes. Inside the royal complex, however, another emotional reality unfolds. Priests conduct ceremonies linking the pharaoh directly to divine cycles of death and rebirth. The king becomes associated increasingly with celestial order itself. His survival after death protects Egypt symbolically. And if the king survives forever, perhaps Egypt does too. The idea comforts people more than you expect. One night you climb a ridge overlooking Saqqara beneath moonlight. The step pyramid glows pale silver against surrounding darkness. Torches flicker along pathways below like tiny drifting stars. Wind moves cool across the desert at last, carrying traces of smoke and distant animal sounds. For a moment, the structure feels almost unreal, human ambition rendered into geometry. You imagine how astonishing this monument must appear to Egyptians seeing it for the first time. Most humans throughout history live among temporary things. Wood rots, mud walls crack, memories fade quickly after funerals end. But this intends to outlast generations, and somehow, impossibly, it largely will. Centuries later, travellers will still stand here staring upward in disbelief. Names will change, dynasties will collapse, entire religions will vanish. Yet the pyramid remains, holding silence inside chambers built for one man terrified of disappearing. That fear becomes strangely moving the longer you stay near these monuments. Powerful rulers often appear distant in historical records, flattened into titles and dates. But beneath every tomb lies the same simple human resistance against oblivion. Djoser wants continuation. He wants recognition. He wants eternity arranged carefully enough that death cannot fully erase him. The workers hauling stone beneath scorching sunlight probably understand that desire too. They simply cannot afford such expensive solutions. Dawn begins approaching again across the eastern horizon. Pale light touches limestone surfaces one careful layer at a time. Birds circle above the Nile Valley far below while labourers slowly wake beside cooking fires. Another day of building eternity begins, and soon Egypt will dream even bigger. The pyramids arrive gradually, not all at once, not perfectly. Egypt learns through failure first. You travel north toward Dashur, where the desert rolls outward beneath a pale blazing sky. And there you find monuments carrying the marks of experimentation like scars. One pyramid rises at an awkward angle midway upward, its sides changing slopes suddenly, as though the builders lost confidence halfway through eternity. Another nearby spreads low and broad across the sand with a reddish hue beneath afternoon light. The kings are learning how to build forever, and forever turns out to be complicated. By now, royal ambition has expanded beyond anything earlier generations imagined possible. Pharaohs no longer want symbolic tombs, they want cosmic certainty rendered in stone. Entire national resources move toward these projects. Quarry workers cut limestone from cliffs upriver. Boats transport blocks along the Nile during flood season. Administrators track labour, grain, copper tools, and water supplies with obsessive care. You begin understanding Egypt as a machine of astonishing coordination. At its centre stands the pharaoh, now viewed not merely as sacred ruler but as a living connection between humanity and divine order. The king's death threatens instability emotionally as much as politically. So his tomb must reassure the nation that continuity survives mortality. The pyramid becomes a promise. You arrive during the reign of Sneferu, one of Egypt's great builders. Historians still debate exactly how beloved he truly was. Though surviving records later portray him warmly compared to many rulers, his projects dominate the landscape. Villages grow around construction sites. Bakers, brewers, physicians, priests, scribes, and labour gangs all orbit the royal obsession with permanence. The air near the quarries tastes like powdered stone. You hear copper chisels striking limestone from sunrise until darkness. Men wrap cloth around their heads against the glare, while foremen organise hauling teams with rhythmic chants. Water carriers become essential figures here. Without them, labour collapses quickly beneath desert heat. One worker jokes that Egypt should build monuments to the people carrying water instead. Nobody disagrees. At night, camps settle into exhausted quiet. The smell of lentils, smoken, and sweat lingers over sleeping quarters. Some men massage blistered hands while others simply stare at flames too tired for conversation. Yet pride exists here too. Workers carve graffiti inside hidden spaces sometimes, leaving gang names or crude jokes beneath stones destined to survive millennia. Human beings always leave fingerprints on eternity. You sit beside a young labourer named Hori while he repairs a torn sandal strap with careful concentration. He tells you he misses the river during long work seasons in the desert. He misses hearing frogs at night. The desert sounds empty, he says softly. Then, after a pause, maybe the dead prefer it that way. The remark hangs between you longer than expected, because death surrounds everything here. Not violently and not grotesquely, methodically. Royal tomb complexes expand into entire sacred landscapes now. Mortuary temples stand beside pyramids where priests maintain rituals long after kings die. Offerings continue daily. Bread, beer, incense, meat, flowers. The dead pharaoh remains socially active through ceremony. You walk through one temple corridor before dawn while priests prepare morning rites. Candle smoke curls upward into dim air carrying scents of myrrh and oil. Footsteps echo softly against stone floors. A priest recites sacred words with practiced calm while another arranges fresh offerings before carved reliefs depicting the king eternally youthful. Outside, the desert waits in silence. Inside, death is managed like administration, and yet beneath all this structure lies genuine emotional need. The Egyptians do not preserve bodies and build pyramids because they are morbid people. They do these things because they love continuity. They fear separation. They cannot accept disappearance easily. You think again about those early desert burials generations ago. A necklace beside the dead, flowers drying in heat. The same emotional current flows here too, only magnified through state power beyond imagination. Eventually you reach Giza. Even from a distance, the pyramids dominate the horizon so completely that your sense of scale falters. The Great Pyramid especially seems less constructed than summoned into existence. Sunlight strikes its limestone casing brilliantly. Workers and officials moving nearby appear almost insect-like against its massive geometry. No description fully prepares you for the feeling. The structure does not merely look large, it alters the landscape psychologically. You climb slowly among crowds of labourers, priests, overseers and craftsmen. Ramps pulse with movement, sledges scrape across stone, commands echo beneath hot wind. Somewhere a man coughs violently from dust inhalation, while another laughs too loudly at a joke you cannot quite hear. Life continues even beside wonders. Historians still argue about certain pyramid-building methods. No clear agreement survives for every detail, but the broader truth remains undeniable. Tens of thousands of people likely contributed through rotating labour systems tied to agricultural cycles. Skilled workers received food, shelter, medical treatment, and organisation sophisticated for the ancient world. You visit one workers' settlement where bread ovens glow before sunrise and physicians treat crushed fingers with honey dressings. A man with a broken rib lies groaning softly while companions tease him for falling asleep during hauling duty. Compassion and impatience coexist naturally here. The state needs these labourers alive. That practical reality sometimes creates unexpected humanity. Nearby, scribes record ration distributions onto papyrus with swift practiced movements. Literacy still belongs mostly to elites and administrators, yet written records now shape enormous projects daily. Egypt runs increasingly on information as much as manpower. You enter a partially completed interior chamber inside the Great Pyramid, where air feels cool and unnervingly still after desert heat outside. Torchlight flickers against polished stone surfaces. The silence inside seems dense enough to touch. One architect stands studying angles carefully beside a measuring cord. His expression carries absolute concentration. A mistake here could damage not merely construction, but cosmic symbolism itself. Everything must align properly. The stars matter. Cardinal directions matter. Sacred mathematics matters. The pyramid is architecture, astronomy, theology, politics and psychology fused into one impossible shape, and at its centre waits a dead king. Or rather, a future dead king. That distinction matters too. Pharaohs begin preparing tombs long before death arrives. Imagine living daily beside your own planned eternity. Imagine supervising the machinery of your eventual burial while still breathing. There is something deeply unsettling about that level of preparation, and strangely understandable. One evening, you stand near the Sphinx while desert wind moves softly across weathered stone. The monument's face watches eternally eastward towards sunrise. Workers nearby share beer from clay jars after finishing the day's labour. Someone sings quietly off-key. Another man falls asleep sitting upright against a limestone block. The contrast feels almost unbearable sometimes. Fragile human bodies beside monuments designed to defeat time itself. Yet perhaps that contrast explains the pyramids better than any engineering theory ever could. Human beings know they die. So occasionally, they build things large enough to argue with death directly. Night settles slowly over Giza now. Torches flicker along pathways beneath enormous dark silhouettes rising into the stars. The desert cools at last. Somewhere distant, priests continue evening rituals for rulers who already imagine themselves eternal. And below those vast monuments, ordinary workers close their eyes for a few precious hours before morning labour begins again. Morning arrives gently along the Nile, though nothing about ordinary life here feels particularly gentle once the work begins. Before sunrise fully lifts above the eastern horizon, bakers already knead dough beside clay ovens radiating fierce heat. The smell of yeast, smoke, and damp grain drifts through narrow streets. Donkeys shuffle impatiently between crowded homes, while fishermen unload silver-scaled catches onto woven mats darkened by river water. The pyramids still stand far away in the desert, but most Egyptians rarely see them closely. Most people live instead inside the rhythm of fields, kitchens, workshops, and crowded riverbanks where survival depends less on cosmic grandeur and more on whether bread rises properly or floodwater reaches the canals in time. You walk through a farming village during harvest season. Wheat bends heavily beneath dry wind. Labourers move slowly through the fields, cutting stalks with curved flint blades, while overseers monitor storage baskets nearby. Chaff clings to sweaty skin. Everyone squints against sunlight reflecting off pale dust. A woman pauses from binding grain bundles to stretch her aching back. She cannot remember ever not being tired. That detail feels strangely important. History often remembers rulers because rulers leave monuments. But civilizations survive because ordinary people continue despite exhaustion. Egypt depends upon farmers more completely than pharaohs sometimes admit publicly. Without successful harvests, temples empty quickly and royal confidence becomes fragile theatre. The Nile remains the true king beneath every dynasty. You spend part of the afternoon inside a scribe school attached to a local administrative centre. Young boys sit cross-legged, copying symbols repeatedly onto wooden tablets coated with plaster. Some concentrate fiercely. Others look half asleep in the heat. Their instructor carries a reed cane for encouragement. He uses it frequently. Literacy offers social mobility rare in this world. A successful scribe avoids back-breaking agricultural labour. He gains status, stability, perhaps even influence. Fathers push sons toward education whenever possible. One boy whispers that his cousin became a temple scribe, and now complains professionally instead of physically. The room erupts briefly with suppressed laughter. Try humour again. Always surviving. Outside the school, life smells of fish oil, mud brick, beer, and human closeness. Houses crowd together for shade. Roofs serve as sleeping spaces during hotter months when indoor air grows unbearable after sunset. Families share rooms tightly. Privacy exists only in fragments, yet tenderness survives easily in cramped places. You watch an elderly woman comb lice carefully from her granddaughter's hair while telling stories about river spirits. Nearby, two brothers repair fishing nets together without speaking much at all. Familiar silence settles between them naturally. A young husband brings figs home unexpectedly, and his wife smiles with visible relief because she has worried all day about feeding relatives arriving tonight. Tiny victories matter here. Very few lives become legendary. Most become intimate. Religion threads through daily existence constantly, though often quietly. Small household shrines stand in corners beside storage jars and woven baskets. Amulets hang around children's necks for protection. Mothers whisper prayers during childbirth. Sailors touch sacred symbols before pushing boats into uncertain currents. The gods do not feel distant to Egyptians. They feel nearby, complicated, sometimes comforting, sometimes dangerous. You enter a crowded market near Memphis where noise rolls through the streets like moving water. Merchants argue over copper prices while goats complain loudly beneath hanging awnings. Linen merchants display fine fabric prized by wealthier households. The scent of roasted duck mixes strangely with animal dung and perfume oils. A physician demonstrates herbal remedies beside a stall selling carved wooden charms against snakebite. Business appears brisk. You notice class differences more clearly here than in smaller villages. Wealthy officials travel with servants and cleaner linen. Their hands show fewer calluses. Jewelry flashes at wrists and collars. Meanwhile, labourers carry baskets so heavy their shoulders remain permanently bent forward. Egyptian society values order deeply, but not equality. Hierarchy settles everywhere. Even so, ordinary people still carve joy from difficult circumstances. Music drifts from homes after dark. Board games appear during idle hours. Festivals transform entire towns into loud emotional currents of dancing, drinking, and ritual celebration. Human beings resist becoming machinery for states completely. One evening you attend a family gathering during a religious festival honouring Hathor. Oil lamps flicker warmly against mud walls while musicians play lutes and rattles in uneven rhythm. Beer flows generously now. Children fall asleep against relatives while older women gossip with astonishing precision about local marriages and disappointments. A farmer sings terribly but enthusiastically. Nobody stops him. Outside, distant temple bells echo softly through the night air. You realise something else while living among these communities. Ancient Egypt is not emotionally monochrome. Popular imagination often freezes Egyptians into solemn figures painted on tomb walls, eternally composed beneath rigid artistic conventions. Real life feels far messier. People flirt, they complain, they grieve dramatically, they become jealous, petty, affectionate, insecure, proud, funny, exhausted, hopeful. Love letters survive from this civilization. So do divorce records, lawsuits, insults, and shopping lists. History becomes far more moving once people regain their humanity. You spend time with a boatman named Panesi who ferries goods along the Nile between settlements. His skin has darkened deeply from years beneath open sunlight. Rope burns mark both hands permanently. He speaks about the river almost like an unpredictable relative. Some days she feeds you, he says. Some days she reminds you not to become arrogant. The Nile carries everything now. Grain, stone, soldiers, priests, news, bodies prepared for burial. Funeral processions move quietly along the water while daily commerce continues nearby with little interruption. Life and death remain physically close together in Egypt, closer than many modern people tolerate comfortably. You witness one burial outside a village cemetery where mourners carry a wrapped body through dry wind beneath fading evening light. The ceremony is modest compared to royal funerals, yet emotional intensity fills every gesture. Relatives bring bread, beer, combs, jewellery, and small carved figures for the journey ahead. One little boy asks whether the dead man will feel lonely underground. His mother hesitates before answering. Then softly, "That is why we visit." The remark lingers with you afterward, because memory itself functions like nourishment here. The dead survive through offerings, names, rituals, and continued emotional attention. To be forgotten becomes a second death far more frightening than physical burial. Even ordinary Egyptians increasingly hope for some version of eternal continuation once reserved mostly for kings. That shift matters enormously. Religious ideas begin democratizing slowly across centuries. More people imagine themselves deserving survival after death. Tomb inscriptions spread beyond royalty. Coffins become more elaborate among prosperous classes. Spiritual hope broadens alongside social complexity. You feel that hope everywhere now, in amulets worn beneath linen clothing, in carefully prepared graves, in names written repeatedly onto pottery and stone, in mothers teaching children funeral prayers beside cooking fires. Night deepens over the Nile once more. Frogs call from irrigation channels while cool air finally softens the day's heat. Villages settle gradually into tired silence, broken occasionally by coughing, distant laughter, or crying infants impossible to soothe completely. Above everything, stars gather across the desert sky with startling clarity. The same stars kings study from temple roofs. The same stars labourers watch before sleeping beside unfinished monuments. The same stars grieving families search while whispering names of the dead. Egypt breathes beneath them all together now, and slowly, patiently, its understanding of death continues growing more intimate. The funeral begins before sunrise. You hear it first as distant voices drifting softly across still morning air, while the Nile remains covered in pale silver mist. Somewhere ahead, women are singing low mourning songs with a rhythm that feels older than language itself. Torches flicker weakly against the fading darkness. Sand crunches beneath careful footsteps. The dead man belonged neither to royalty nor poverty, a middle-aged official, literate, moderately prosperous. Loved enough that many people arrive before dawn despite the cold. You follow quietly behind the procession as relatives carry his wrapped body toward the western bank of the Nile, where the land of the dead slowly expands generation after generation beneath desert cliffs. Egyptians bury their dead west of the river because the sun dies there each evening. Even geography becomes symbolic now. The living remain in the east. The dead travel westward with the setting light. The mourners move slowly through reeds wet with morning moisture. Priests carry incense burners releasing thin streams of fragrant smoke into the cool air. Family members hold offerings wrapped carefully in linen bundles. Bread, beer, dried fish, sandals, small carved amulets, objects against loneliness. You notice how intimate the preparations feel. Nothing here resembles theatrical spectacle. Grief settles unevenly across different faces. One daughter cries openly while her older brother stares ahead with exhausted numbness. The dead man's wife keeps touching the edge of his burial cloth unconsciously, as though reassuring herself he remains physically present a little longer. Human beings delay goodbye whenever possible. By now, Egyptian beliefs about death have grown far more detailed than those early desert burials centuries ago. The soul itself is understood as complicated, divided into different spiritual aspects. The ka represents vital essence requiring nourishment after death. The ba, often depicted as a bird with a human head, moves between worlds. The name must survive. The body must remain preserved enough for spiritual reunion. Death becomes a logistical problem as much as a spiritual mystery. You enter the embalming workshop shortly after the funeral rites begin. The room smells sharply of natron salt, oils, resin, smoke, and something heavier lingering underneath despite every attempt to control it. Open windows allow desert air inside. Though little breeze reaches this far today, the embalmers work with calm professionalism. One elderly man washes his hands methodically before touching the body. Another arranges linen strips beside polished tools. They speak little during preparation itself. Ritual words matter here. Precision matters. Mistakes could endanger eternity. You watch carefully as the process begins. Historians still debate certain technical details varying across periods and social classes, but the broader procedure remains remarkably sophisticated. The brain may be removed through the nose using hooked instruments. Internal organs are extracted carefully through an incision in the side. The body cavity is cleaned with palm wine and packed temporarily with natron to dry remaining moisture. The organs themselves matter deeply. Liver, lungs, stomach, intestines. Each receives protection through sacred association with divine forces. Canopic jars stand waiting nearby with carved lids shaped like protective beings. Even anatomy becomes theology in Egypt. One young apprentice hesitates before making an incision. His instructor watches silently. Finally, the older man says, "Gentle hands, he belonged to someone." That sentence changes the room completely. For a moment, the body stops being ritual material or technical responsibility. He becomes human again. A husband. A father, perhaps. Someone who laughed during meals and complained about taxes and worried privately during flood season. Death strips identity away frighteningly fast. The embalmers fight against that disappearance. Outside the workshop, ordinary life continues almost rudely. Vendors argue in the street over onion prices. Children chase stray dogs through dusty alleys. A fisherman repairs nets beside the riverbank while humming tunelessly. Ancient Egypt never pauses entirely for mourning. Survival demands continuation, and yet grief still reshapes time for individuals enduring it. The widow waits nearby beneath woven shadecloth through much of the embalming period. Elite mummification can take around 70 days. 70 long days between death and burial. She brings offerings regularly. She speaks softly with priests about proper rituals. Some afternoons she simply sits silently staring toward the workshop entrance while flies drift lazily through hot air. You sense how exhausting mourning becomes physically. Grief consumes energy like labour. One evening during the embalming period, you share bread beside a family preparing funerary linens by lamplight. Women fold cloth carefully while discussing practical matters, which relatives will attend burial ceremonies, whether enough beer has been prepared, which amulets should rest closest to the chest. Then conversation suddenly falters. The dead man's youngest son quietly asks whether his father will recognize them after death. Nobody answers immediately. Finally, his grandmother touches his shoulder gently. If we remember him properly, she says, he will find his way. Memory again. Always memory. The Egyptians understand something emotionally difficult long before modern psychology gives it language. Mourning is partly fear. Not only fear of death itself, but fear that love may vanish without trace. Their rituals attempt to protect relationships from erosion. You return later to the embalming chamber near completion of the process. The body has transformed astonishingly. Skin darkened and tightened. Features preserved into calm stillness. Linen wrapping begins layer by layer with patient attention. Resin seals portions carefully. Protective amulets slide between folds at sacred positions. The atmosphere feels strangely peaceful now. Not comforting exactly, but purposeful. A priest recites funerary texts while another traces sacred symbols onto linen with ink. Certain words carry protective power when spoken correctly. Language itself becomes part of resurrection. You notice how the embalmers avoid unnecessary roughness throughout the work. Despite practical realities, tenderness survives here too. One man adjusts the wrapped hands until they rest more naturally across the chest. Small dignities matter, especially for the dead. At last the burial day arrives. Heat shimmers above desert stone by midday while mourners gather beside the tomb entrance carrying flowers already wilting in sunlight. Musicians play slow, mournful melodies through reed flutes. Professional mourners wail dramatically near the front of the procession, though the family's quieter grief feels more affecting somehow. Inside the tomb chamber, painted scenes cover walls with images of food, servants, gardens, boats, music, and abundance. The dead man receives an idealized eternity, shaped from everything comforting about earthly existence. No Egyptian paradise promises abstract perfection. It promises familiarity, cool water, good harvests, loved ones nearby. Enough food at the table. The final rituals unfold carefully now. Priests perform the opening of the mouth ceremony, using sacred instruments to symbolically restore the senses after death. The deceased must breathe, speak, eat, and see again in the next world. When the tomb finally seals, silence settles heavily across the desert. The family remains there a while longer beneath harsh afternoon light. Nobody seems eager to leave him alone. The embalming house stands near the desert edge where dry air helps the dead surrender moisture slowly. From outside, the building appears almost ordinary. Mud brick walls, narrow windows, palm fibers hanging above shaded entrances. Yet inside, entire generations of knowledge pass quietly between careful hands. The smell reaches you first. Resin warmed over charcoal, natron salt, cedar oil, linen, and beneath everything else, the stubborn human reality of death itself. You enter before dawn while darkness still clings to the corners of the room. Oil lamps flicker against plaster walls stained faintly by years of smoke. The embalmers have already begun working. They prefer cooler hours whenever possible. One apprentice sweeps the floor with nervous concentration, while an older embalmer sharpens bronze tools beside a shallow basin of water. No one speaks loudly here. Death encourages softer voices. The body resting upon the stone table belongs to a woman perhaps 30 years old. Her husband waits outside with relatives, trying unsuccessfully to appear composed. He spent much of yesterday discussing payment arrangements with temple officials and craftsmen. Mummification has become increasingly elaborate over centuries, but quality depends heavily upon wealth. The finest methods remain expensive. Even eternity develops social classes. Still, families sacrifice enormously for proper burial. They sell livestock, they borrow grain, they negotiate desperately with relatives. To neglect the dead feels emotionally unbearable and spiritually dangerous at once. One elderly embalmer notices you observing the woman's face before work begins. "She was beautiful," he says quietly. Then after a pause, "She still is, if you're gentle." The remark carries no performance, only habit shaped through decades among the dead. You watch the preparation unfold slowly through the morning. The embalmers move with technical precision refined across centuries. Each gesture serves practical and symbolic purpose together. The body must survive physically so the spirit can recognize its earthly home later. That belief transforms anatomy into sacred responsibility. The removal of internal organs proceeds carefully now. Assistants rinse instruments repeatedly while priests recite protective words nearby. Sunlight gradually enters through narrow windows, illuminating floating dust and incense smoke in pale shafts across the chamber. Outside, ordinary Egypt continues without pause. Merchants shout across crowded streets. Farmers lead donkeys toward irrigation canals. Children complain about chores with timeless consistency. Somewhere nearby, bread burns accidentally in an oven, and someone curses loudly enough to disturb resting birds from the roofline. Life remains inconsiderately alive beside death. Perhaps that contrast explains why Egyptian funerary rituals become so elaborate. They create controlled order against the chaos of mortality. The embalmers cannot stop death itself, but they can resist decay carefully, intelligently, patiently, and patience defines everything here. The drying process alone may last more than a month. Natron surrounds the body completely, drawing moisture away until flesh tightens and hardens. During this waiting period, relatives continue visiting regularly. They bring oils, linens, jewelry, written prayers. Some sit outside simply talking softly about the deceased as though conversation itself keeps memory alive. You spend one evening with the dead woman's sister beside the riverbank during this long interval. Night insects drift above black water, while fishermen guide boats homeward through moonlit currents. The sister twists reeds absently between nervous fingers. She hated cold mornings. She says suddenly, "You ask nothing." She continues anyway. She would complain before sunrise every winter, loudly, every single morning. Then unexpectedly she laughs through tears. Grief moves strangely between pain and affection. The Egyptians understand this emotional movement deeply. Their mourning rituals allow visible sorrow without shame. Tomb art depicts families embracing. Lamentations become formalized performances. Love survives publicly rather than hidden away. Back inside the embalming house, wrapping begins at last. This stage feels almost meditative. Linen strips wind carefully around fingers, wrists, limbs, torso, neck. Resin seals layers together gradually. Protective amulets disappear beneath folds at specific points. A scarab rests near the heart. Sacred symbols protect vulnerable places. The woman's face remains uncovered longest. One apprentice works especially slowly there, smoothing linen around the cheeks with astonishing gentleness. His instructor watches approvingly. People remember faces, the old man says. The apprentice nods. No further explanation seems necessary. You realise something important during these long hours beside the embalmers. Mummification is neither cold science nor pure mysticism. It exists in the uneasy space between practical craftsmanship and emotional desperation. The Egyptians study preservation because they cannot accept complete disappearance. The body becomes an anchor for memory. A husband wants to recognise his wife again someday. A child wants his mother's face preserved against oblivion. That longing drives centuries of funerary innovation more powerfully than abstract theology ever could. The workshop stores completed coffins nearby awaiting final ceremonies. Some are simple painted wood, others glitter with gold leaf and detailed inscriptions. Human faces stare outward from polished surfaces with idealized calm. Eyes outlined in black seem strangely alert beneath lamplight. You walk slowly among them at night after workers leave. The room smells faintly sweet from resin and cedar oil. Silence gathers thickly here. Hundreds of preserved bodies rest within painted containers designed to resemble eternal versions of themselves. Not younger exactly, more complete, more permanent. One coffin belonging to a wealthy scribe includes tiny painted scenes showing him enjoying music, food, and riverside gardens in the afterlife. Another depicts a mother seated beside children holding lotus flowers. Their eternity remains profoundly domestic. The Egyptian afterlife is rarely about conquest. It is about continuation. You return outside before dawn, where cool desert wind brushes softly across your skin. Nearby, a family prepares funerary offerings beside woven baskets. Bread, onions, beer jars sealed carefully with clay. The dead still require nourishment. Or perhaps the living require the act of giving. Historians debate many theological details surrounding ancient Egyptian beliefs. Accounts shift across centuries and regions. Religious traditions overlap rather than align neatly, yet emotionally, the underlying pattern feels remarkably consistent. The dead remain socially present. They can help or harm the living. They deserve care. They deserve remembrance. A society organized around such beliefs inevitably develops extraordinary relationships with physical remains. Tomb robbery becomes not merely theft, but violation. Damage to names or faces carries terrifying implications. Preservation becomes sacred defense against annihilation. The final burial ceremony for the woman begins near sunset. Her wrapped body now rests within a painted coffin, smelling richly of fresh resin and cedar. Priests chant beneath drifting incense while relatives place flowers around the bier. Her husband steps forward last. For several seconds he says nothing at all. Then quietly, almost embarrassed by the simplicity, "I still don't know how to sleep without you." The honesty of it cuts through every formal ritual surrounding him. Because beneath the gold, the linen, the sacred words, and the elaborate preparations, ancient Egypt still revolves around one painfully familiar truth. Human beings cannot bear losing each other easily. Night settles slowly across the desert now. Stars emerge above silent tombs stretching westward into darkness. Inside those chambers, preserved bodies wait beside offerings, prayers, and names written carefully against forgetting. And somewhere among them, countless hearts continue hoping memory can outlive death. The tomb begins filling long before the body arrives. You notice that immediately. Servants carry furniture through narrow corridors while painters still work by lamplight on unfinished walls. The air smells of wet plaster, cedarwood, resin, and dust shaken loose from limestone ceilings. Outside, the desert burns beneath afternoon heat. But inside the tomb, the temperature remains cool and strangely still. It feels less like a grave than a household preparing for permanent residence. That is exactly the intention. By now, Egyptians increasingly believe the afterlife mirrors earthly existence closely enough that practical comfort matters. A dead person may still need chairs, sandals, cosmetics, blankets, games, food containers, writing tools, jewelry, and music. Tombs become carefully assembled worlds designed against absence. You watch craftsmen carrying a carved wooden bed into a burial chamber belonging to a provincial noblewoman. One leg snaps accidentally against a doorway. Everyone freezes. The silence afterward feels enormous. Finally, an exhausted carpenter mutters, "She'll forgive us if the repairs hold." Nervous laughter follows immediately. Even here, among rituals surrounding eternity, human beings remain painfully aware of imperfection. The tomb walls glow softly beneath oil lamps while artists paint scenes of daily life with astonishing tenderness. Gardens crowded with birds, fishing boats drifting through reeds, musicians playing harps beside banquet tables, servants bringing wine, children gathering lotus flowers near riverbanks. Egyptian tomb art rarely obsesses over heroic warfare. It obsesses over continuity. The dead wish to keep living recognizable lives. You stand beside a painter grinding mineral pigments into smooth color while he explains quietly that green symbolizes renewal and rebirth. Blue belongs partly to the heavens and sacred water. Gold resembles divine flesh itself beneath sunlight. Colors survive longer than people, he says without bitterness. Then he returns to painting delicate feathers onto a duck no living visitor may see again once the tomb seals. The emotional contradiction feels overwhelming sometimes. So much labor devoted toward hidden beauty. Yet perhaps secrecy strengthens the sincerity. These paintings exist primarily for the dead themselves, not public admiration. Ancient Egyptian tombs function like private conversations with eternity. You walk deeper into the burial chambers where funerary goods wait carefully arranged across woven mats. Chests filled with linen clothing, cosmetic jars still carrying traces of scented oils, hair combs carved from ivory, small stools polished smooth by use, board games with pieces ready for play. One tiny doll rests among the belongings, a child's toy buried beside an adult woman. You wonder briefly whether it belonged to her daughter once. No inscription explains. Some emotional histories vanish forever despite all preservation efforts. Nearby stand rows of shabtis, small funerary figurines placed inside tombs to serve the dead in the afterlife. Their painted faces stare outward calmly beneath flickering torchlight. Wealthier burials contain hundreds of them sometimes, each prepared to answer labor demands in eternity so the deceased may rest comfortably. Even paradise apparently requires workforce management. The practical imagination of ancient Egypt never entirely disappears. Outside the tomb complex, funeral workshops bustle constantly now. Coffin makers shape cedar planks beneath open shade structures while scribes copy funerary texts onto papyrus rolls. The smell of sawdust mixes with hot wind and incense drifting from nearby shrines. Business thrives around mortality. You spend an afternoon with a coffin painter named Teti whose hands remain permanently stained with pigment. He works quietly, almost lovingly, across the face of an anthropoid coffin shaped like the deceased within. Black lines define the eyes carefully. Gold leaf catches sunlight in brilliant flashes. Families always ask for peaceful expressions, he says. No one wants eternity looking worried. Again, that dry Egyptian humour surfaces briefly through exhaustion. Teti explains that names matter more than almost anything else in burial preparation. A properly written name preserves identity beyond death. Damage a name, erase it completely, and spiritual survival itself becomes endangered. You think about that long afterward. How terrifying it must feel to imagine being forgotten entirely. Modern people fear death too, of course. But Egyptians fear erasure with extraordinary intensity. Tomb goods, inscriptions, portraits, statues, and offerings all fight against the same enemy: disappearance. One evening you attend a burial feast held before final interment. Relatives gather beside the tomb entrance beneath cooling twilight, while musicians play soft melodies through reed pipes. Servants distribute bread, figs, roasted duck, and beer. Some mourners cry openly, others laugh unexpectedly while sharing stories about the deceased. Grief and celebration overlap naturally here. An elderly uncle becomes emotional describing how the dead woman once threw a sandal at him during an argument about goats many years earlier. The family bursts into exhausted laughter through tears. For several moments she returns vividly among them again, alive through memory rather than ritual. That may be the true purpose beneath all these funerary customs. Not merely preserving bodies, preserving relationships. You notice how often Egyptian burial practices emphasize social continuity. Husbands and wives appear together in tomb art holding hands. Family groups dine eternally beside one another in painted scenes. Ancestors receive ongoing offerings from descendants. The afterlife remains communal. Loneliness frightens the Egyptians almost as much as death itself. Inside another tomb under preparation, scribes paint offering formulas onto walls in neat black and red hieroglyphs. The texts request bread, beer, oxen, fowl, incense, linen, and everything good and pure for the deceased forever. Forever becomes a practical word here. You ask one young scribe whether he believes these inscriptions truly work. He pauses thoughtfully before answering. My mother still speaks to my father every morning, he says. She says the dead hear more clearly than the living. Then he shrugs slightly and dips his brush again into ink. The boundary between religion and emotional survival feels impossible to separate now. As centuries pass, tomb goods grow increasingly sophisticated. Jewelry demonstrates status. Imported materials display wealth and connections. Fine linen wraps delicate objects carefully against damage. Some elites commission miniature servant models performing household tasks eternally. Bakers knead dough forever in tiny wooden workshops. Brewers strain beer eternally beside painted vats. The dead surround themselves with motion frozen into permanence. Yet despite luxury differences, the emotional core remains remarkably consistent across social classes. Rich or poor, people bury what they cannot bear to lose completely. A comb, a favourite cup, a necklace touched countless times during life, a letter, a child's toy. Human grief becomes archaeological evidence. Night deepens around the necropolis now. Wind moves softly through unfinished tomb corridors carrying traces of dust and lamp smoke. Somewhere nearby, workers still hammer quietly despite the late hour. A family wants preparations completed before an auspicious day arrives. The dead cannot wait indefinitely. You pause beside a sealed tomb entrance beneath the stars. Somewhere inside rests a carefully preserved body surrounded by food, furniture, prayers, painted gardens, and names written again and again against silence. An entire civilization keeps building these fragile defences against forgetting, and soon, words themselves will become among the most powerful protections of all. The scribe bends low over the papyrus while morning light gathers slowly across the room. Reed brush in hand, he works with patient concentration, shaping black ink into lines of careful symbols that seem almost alive against the pale surface. Nearby, another apprentice grinds pigment with a stone mortar, muttering softly because his hands already ache before midday. The room smells of ink, old linen, lamp smoke, and dry reeds harvested from the Nile marshes. Outside, temple courtyards fill gradually with footsteps and distant voices. But in here, silence carries weight. Writing demands it. You settle beside the scribes while they copy funerary texts destined for tombs farther west in the necropolis. Rolls of papyrus rest stacked carefully along wooden shelves. Some contain tax records, others preserve hymns, prayers, legal agreements, medical instructions, and stories. But these particular texts concern death and survival beyond it. Egyptian writing now reaches far beyond practical administration. Language itself becomes sacred technology. Words possess power when arranged correctly. Spells protect the dead from danger. Names preserve identity. Sacred formulas guide souls through terrifying uncertainties after death. You notice how respectfully the scribes handle funerary manuscripts compared to ordinary documents. One young copyist wipes his hands carefully before touching a nearly completed scroll. "These words travel farther than we do," he says quietly. The remark feels true in ways he probably does not fully realize. Many Egyptians still cannot read. Literacy remains concentrated among priests, administrators, and educated elites. Yet written words shape society increasingly from behind the scenes. A properly inscribed tomb wall can sustain offerings forever. A damaged name can endanger eternal existence. Writing becomes a bridge between worlds. You walk through temple archives where papyrus scrolls rest inside wooden chests, protected from moisture and insects as carefully as possible. Priests move among them with calm familiarity. Some texts are ancient already, copied repeatedly across generations because originals grow too fragile with age. One elderly archivist smiles faintly while repairing a torn manuscript. "Papyrus dies too," he says, "so we teach it to live again." That sentence captures something essential about Egypt itself. This civilization preserves constantly. Bodies, buildings, memories, rituals, words. Everything fights against erosion. You spend the afternoon beside a funerary workshop where scribes personalize burial texts for wealthy clients. Names are inserted carefully into sacred formulas. Illustrations depict the deceased approaching divine beings, receiving offerings, sailing through celestial waters. No two manuscripts feel entirely identical. Death becomes strangely customized. One customer complains politely that his painted likeness appears too severe. The artist stares at him for several seconds before replying, "You asked for dignity?" The room falls quiet. Then everyone laughs harder than expected. Even preparations for eternity cannot fully suppress ordinary vanity. As centuries pass, funerary texts evolve dramatically. Earlier royal inscriptions once belonged almost exclusively to kings. Pyramid texts protected pharaohs through sacred spells carved directly into stone chambers. Later, coffin texts spread many of these ideas beyond royalty toward nobles and prosperous officials. Now more ordinary Egyptians begin hoping for personal salvation too. The afterlife slowly democratizes. That shift changes emotional life profoundly. A farmer may never expect royal luxury after death, but he increasingly hopes his soul might survive. A mother hopes protective spells guide her safely through darkness. A craftsman wants his name remembered beside proper prayers. The promise of eternity broadens outward across society one generation at a time. You accompany a temple scribe named Mena through the necropolis at dusk while he delivers completed funerary manuscripts to grieving families. Wind moves softly across desert stone. Torches flicker beside tomb entrances where priests continue evening rites. Mena carries the scrolls wrapped carefully in linen. "People think we sell magic," he says as you walk. "Mostly we sell reassurance." The honesty surprises you, but perhaps reassurance has always been part of religion everywhere. At one tomb, a widow receives a newly finished manuscript with trembling hands. The painted scenes show her dead husband fishing among idealized marshes filled with birds and lotus flowers. She traces his illustrated face gently with one fingertip. For a moment she cannot speak. Then, softly, "He hated fishing." Mena blinks. "Why paint him fishing then?" The woman almost smiles through tears. "Because he wished he loved it. He always thought peaceful men should enjoy fishing." Grief reveals people strangely. The scribes do not merely preserve doctrine, they preserve aspiration. Funerary texts depict idealized continuations of life. People wish to maintain forever. Eternal abundance, eternal health, eternal companionship. You sit later inside a small candlelit chamber where apprentices practice copying sacred symbols onto broken pottery fragments. Their teacher paces slowly behind them, correcting posture and brush control with exhausting precision. "Poor handwriting insults the gods," he warns. One student whispers that the gods should try writing all day themselves. Again the suppressed laughter, again the timeless exhaustion of students everywhere. Yet beneath the humour lies genuine reverence. Egyptians believe spoken and written language shapes reality directly. Certain words activate protection, certain names invoke power. Spells function less like fantasy incantations and more like carefully structured negotiations with the unseen world. You begin noticing texts everywhere now. Amulets inscribed with prayers, coffins covered in sacred formulas, temple walls crowded with hieroglyphs, tiny labels attached to offerings, words spread across Egypt like protective nets against chaos. One evening during flood season, heavy moisture hangs over the Nile while scribes work late beside oil lamps attracting clouds of insects. The air feels thick and warm. Sweat darkens linen collars. Still they continue copying funerary passages with stubborn concentration. A young apprentice asks his instructor whether the dead truly read these texts themselves. The older man pauses before answering. No clear agreement survives, he says carefully. Some priests believe the soul hears the words spoken aloud. Others think the writing itself holds power even unread. Then he glances toward the unfinished manuscript nearby. But grieving families sleep better knowing the words exist. That may be the most human explanation of all. The manuscripts grow increasingly beautiful over time. Colours brighten, illustrations expand. Divine figures appear beside dangerous creatures lurking within the afterlife landscape. Serpents, gates, rivers, judgment scenes. Death becomes a journey requiring guidance, and soon, one collection of funerary spells will emerge more famous than all the rest. Not a single book originally, not one official text, but a changing collection of prayers, instructions, warnings, passwords, and hopes copied across centuries onto papyrus buried beside the dead. Later generations will call it the Book of the Dead. But here, in these flickering workshops beside the Nile, begins more quietly. As anxious people searching for the right words against darkness, night settles fully outside now. Temple bells echo faintly across the river while scribes continue writing beneath dim lamplight. Brushstrokes whisper against papyrus in steady rhythms. Some of these texts will survive thousands of years sealed inside tombs beneath dry, desert air. Long after voices fade, long after kingdoms fall, long after the hands writing them turn to dust themselves. The papyrus crackles softly as the priest unrolls it across a low wooden table. Oil lamps burn nearby, their flames bending gently in the warm night air, drifting through the temple chamber. Shadows move across painted walls crowded with gods, stars, boats, and sacred symbols repeated through centuries of careful memory. You lean closer. The manuscript stretches farther than expected. Columns of hieroglyphs march beside vivid illustrations painted in red, blue, green, gold, and black. Human souls stand before strange beings with animal heads. Serpents coil beside gateways. Rivers divide unseen territories. Tiny figures raise their hands in prayer while celestial boats cross the heavens above them. This is not merely decoration, it is navigation. The Egyptians do not imagine death as a peaceful drifting sleep. The afterlife contains danger, confusion, judgment, and uncertainty. A soul may lose its way. It may face hostile spirits. It may fail to speak the proper words at the proper gates. Survival beyond death requires preparation. That preparation slowly gathers into what modern people call the Book of the Dead. Though no Egyptian ever uses that exact title, the ancient name translates more closely to something like the Book of Going Forth by Day. Already the phrasing feels revealing. The dead are not imagined as trapped beneath eternal darkness. They hope to emerge again, to move freely, to continue. You sit beside the priest while he explains portions of the manuscript to a wealthy family commissioning burial texts for an elderly relative now gravely ill. Outside, distant temple music drifts faintly through the night. Incense smoke curls upward, carrying scents of myrrh and cedar resin. The family listens with exhausted concentration. Her daughter asks whether every spell must be included. The priest hesitates diplomatically. Some provide greater protection than others, which is another way of saying eternity becomes more comfortable for those who can afford comprehensive guidance. The Book of the Dead is not a single fixed work. No official version exists. Different manuscripts contain different combinations of spells gathered across generations from older funerary traditions. Wealthier Egyptians purchase longer, more beautifully illustrated copies. Poorer individuals may receive only selected passages or simplified protections. Even in death, inequality persists. Yet the emotional purpose remains remarkably universal. People want reassurance against the unknown. You study one illustration showing the deceased approaching a series of gates guarded by frightening supernatural beings. Each guardian demands specific knowledge before allowing passage. Correct names matter. Correct responses matter. The afterlife resembles bureaucracy sometimes. Ancient Egypt never entirely escapes administration. One young scribe copying passages nearby mutters that he hopes the gods appreciate paperwork as much as priests do. His instructor pretends not to hear him. You smile despite yourself. Humor survives because fear does, and these texts emerge from fear as much as faith. You begin recognizing recurring themes throughout the spells. Protection from decapitation, protection from hunger, protection from having one's heart stolen, guidance through darkness, assistance speaking before divine judges, preservation of memory and identity. The soul must remain whole. That idea appears constantly. One passage asks that the dead person retain the ability to breathe, eat, drink, walk, remember, and love beyond death. The requests feel heartbreakingly physical. Egyptians do not seek abstract spiritual transcendence. They seek recognizable existence. Continuation matters more than transformation. You accompany a funerary artist named Nebaman while he illustrates one manuscript commissioned for a wealthy merchant. His brush moves steadily across papyrus, while daylight fades outside the workshop windows. He paints the deceased standing beside lush fields watered eternally by peaceful canals. People always request extra greenery, he says quietly. The desert frightens them. The remark lingers with you. Of course it does. Most Egyptian life depends upon the narrow green corridor surrounding the Nile. Beyond it waits barren silence and death. Their paradise naturally resembles fertile riverbanks under perfect conditions forever. No failed floods, no famine, no separation. Nebaman pauses occasionally to sharpen reed brushes with a small knife. Paint stains darken his fingertips permanently. Around him, unfinished manuscripts cover tables and shelves like fragments of private hopes awaiting completion. One nearby scroll includes spell 125 among the most important passages in the entire tradition. You recognize the scene immediately from countless later reproductions. The weighing of the heart, a human heart balanced against the feather of Ma'at, symbol of truth and cosmic order. Nearby waits the monstrous devourer Amit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus. If the heart proves heavy with wrongdoing, the soul faces annihilation, not torture. Erasure! Again, Egypt fears disappearance above all. You ask Nebaman whether people fear this judgment deeply. He shrugs slightly. Mostly they fear being remembered incorrectly. The answer feels wiser than expected, because the confession accompanying judgment reveals something fascinating about Egyptian morality. The deceased declares what they have not done. I have not stolen. I have not murdered. I have not caused suffering. I have not cheated the hungry. The statements sound less like perfect holiness and more like social responsibility. Egypt's moral world revolves around preserving balance and avoiding harm within the community. That again. Always balance. As evening deepens, you attend a gathering where priests recite portions of funerary texts aloud for grieving relatives. Oil lamps flicker against painted columns while listeners sit quietly upon woven mats. Some close their eyes during the recitations, others stare toward the floor, visibly exhausted from morning rituals lasting weeks or months. One old woman mouths familiar passages softly along with the priest. She has likely heard them many times before, perhaps for parents, perhaps for siblings, perhaps for a husband now resting beneath desert stone. The Book of the Dead does not merely instruct the deceased, it comforts the living too. It offers structure against chaos, a map against terror. Even if accounts differ and no clear agreement survives regarding every theological detail, the emotional function remains unmistakable. People sleep better believing someone prepared the road ahead. Later that night, you walk through the necropolis beneath cold stars while desert wind moves gently across sealed tomb entrances. Somewhere inside many of these chambers lie papyrus scrolls rolled carefully beside preserved bodies. Instructions for crossing darkness, spells against loneliness, words written lovingly against silence. You imagine future archaeologists unrolling those manuscripts thousands of years later, beneath electric lights in distant museums, modern eyes studying ancient fears, modern hands touching fragile hopes preserved by dry desert air. And suddenly the distance between worlds feels very small, because despite all the strange gods and elaborate rituals, the Book of the Dead speaks to something painfully familiar, the wish not to enter darkness alone. The Temple of Osiris smells of incense, damp stone, and old candle smoke trapped within narrow chambers for generations. You enter before dawn while priests move silently through corridors carrying oil lamps that cast trembling gold light against painted walls. Outside, the Nile Valley still sleeps beneath blue darkness. Inside, the gods are already awake, or at least the people serving them hope so. You stand beside worshippers gathered for a ritual morning ceremony. Their voices rise softly together, not loud enough to feel theatrical, but heavy with genuine sorrow. One woman presses linen against her eyes while a priest recites sacred verses describing death, dismemberment, and restoration. The story of Osiris lies at the emotional center of Egyptian belief now, not merely because he rules the dead, because he dies first. That matters enormously. Long before later religions shape the Mediterranean world, Egyptians already imagine a divine being murdered, mourned, reassembled, and reborn into eternal life. Osiris becomes proof that death itself may be survived. You listen while priests retell the ancient story beneath drifting incense smoke. Osiris once ruled Egypt wisely, bringing order and civilization. His jealous brother Seth murdered him, sealed his body inside a coffin, and cast it away. Later, Isis, wife of Osiris, searched tirelessly across the world gathering his scattered remains piece by piece. The image feels painfully intimate, a grieving woman refusing disappearance. The worshippers around you know this story by heart, yet many still cry quietly during its recitation. Myth here does not function like entertainment, it functions like emotional architecture. The gods experience grief, loss, jealousy, love, exhaustion, fear. Divinity feels deeply human in Egypt. You walk deeper into the temple where painted reliefs show Isis kneeling beside the dead Osiris, with wings spread protectively around him. Candlelight flickers across her face, giving the illusion of movement. Nearby priests arrange offerings of bread, beer, flowers, and fruit before sacred statues hidden within inner sanctuaries. One young acolyte whispers that Isis never stops searching, not even after everyone else believed hope impossible. Perhaps that explains her enduring power. People trust gods who understand desperation personally. Outside the temple complex, ordinary Egyptians wear amulets shaped like the Eye of Horus, the Ankh, or protective divine figures. Religion surrounds daily life constantly now. Sailors pray before dangerous journeys. Mothers invoke Taweret during childbirth. Farmers appeal to fertility gods before planting season, yet among all divine beings, those associated with death and protection carry especially emotional importance. Anubis watches over the dead with his jackal head and calm black eyes. You encounter his priests near an embalming workshop west of the Nile. Their robes smell faintly of resin and smoke. One elderly priest gently adjusts a funerary mask resting beside a prepared body, while younger assistants organize linen strips nearby. People fear Anubis unnecessarily, he says quietly. He does not hunt. The distinction matters. Modern imagination often transforms Egyptian gods into exotic curiosities or frightening symbols. Living Egyptians experience them differently. Anubis represents careful passage through dangerous territory, a protector of vulnerable souls, a guardian against chaos during the terrifying transition between life and death. You realize many Egyptian gods perform emotional functions as much as cosmic ones. They organize fear, they shape grief into survivable patterns. One evening during flood season, you attend a household ritual honoring deceased ancestors. Rain almost never falls here, yet heavy moisture thickens the air tonight. Frogs call loudly from irrigation canals while relatives gather around a small domestic shrine lit by oil lamps. A grandmother places bread before painted ancestor figures. A child asks whether the dead become lonely underground. The grandmother smiles sadly. That is why the gods travel with them. Simple answers carry enormous tenderness sometimes. You spend time with temple musicians rehearsing hymns dedicated to Isis. Harps, flutes, and rattles fill dim halls with slow aching melodies that seem designed for mourning processions. One singer closes her eyes while practicing, visibly emotional even during rehearsal. These songs belong to everyone eventually, she says afterward. No one argues. Death remains universal beneath every social class and every palace wall. Even pharaohs depend upon divine protection after death. Especially pharaohs, perhaps. Royal tombs increasingly identify dead kings with Osiris himself. The ruler dies physically but rises spiritually into eternal continuity. Kings become gods. Gods become mourners. The boundaries blur constantly. You visit Abydos, one of the most sacred centers associated with Osiris worship. Pilgrims travel enormous distances to leave offerings there. Some cannot afford proper tombs nearby, so they place simple stele-bearing names and prayers within temple precincts instead. Again, the same fear. Do not forget me. Do not let my name disappear. The desert wind carries sand softly across thousands of carved inscriptions left by ordinary people, hoping sacred proximity grants protection after death. Merchants, soldiers, mothers, scribes. People history rarely remembers individually, yet here they remain. One inscription catches your attention because of its plain honesty. A man asks Osiris simply for a good burial and remembrance by my children. Not wealth, not glory, remembrance. The request feels timeless enough to hurt slightly. Inside the temple, priests prepare a ritual reenactment of Osiris's death and restoration. Participants carry symbolic objects through torchlit courtyards, while mourners sing laments echoing against stone walls. Some historians believe these ceremonies helped ordinary Egyptians emotionally process mortality itself through collective participation. Watching it unfold, you suspect they're right. Ritual gives grief rhythm. Without rhythm, sorrow can drown people completely. You notice too how Egyptian religion tolerates contradiction comfortably. Different regions worship gods differently. Myths overlap rather than align neatly. Some accounts differ dramatically from others. No single unified doctrine controls every belief. Yet, emotionally, the system holds together through shared concerns: protection, continuity, balance, survival. One exhausted priest admits quietly over a late meal that even temple scholars debate theological details endlessly. But when someone dies, he says while tearing bread apart slowly, families still ask the same questions. Will they be safe? Will they remember us? Will we see them again? The questions survive every generation unchanged. Night deepens over the temple now. Incense lingers heavily in the air while distant bells echo through darkened courtyards. Somewhere within the sanctuary, sacred statues rest hidden behind sealed doors. Outside, pilgrims sleep beneath the stars wrapped in rough blankets after long journeys along the Nile. And beneath the desert westward, countless dead lie beside prayers invoking Osiris, Isis, and Anubis against the loneliness waiting beyond breath. The gods cannot erase death, but they make the darkness feel inhabited. The hall feels impossibly quiet, not empty quiet, waiting quiet. You stand within a painted chamber deep inside a tomb where torchlight trembles against scenes of judgment, preserved in mineral colour for thousands of years. The air smells faintly of dust, smoke, and old stone cooled by darkness. A head beneath painted stars. A dead man faces his own heart. This moment appears everywhere now in Egyptian funerary imagination. The weighing of the heart. Not battle, not punishment by fire. Judgment through balance. A scale stands at the centre of the scene. On one side rests the heart of the deceased, believed to contain memory, conscience, intention, and moral truth together. On the other rests the feather of Ma'at, symbol of cosmic order and honesty. Nearby waits Anubis with calm attention. Thoth records the outcome carefully, and crouching below the scales, patient as hunger itself, waits Amit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, a creature assembled from Egypt's most feared predators. If the heart proves too heavy with wrongdoing, Amit devours it completely, and the soul ends there. No afterlife, no continuation, no remembrance, only erasure. You remain staring at the painted scene longer than expected because suddenly everything feels emotionally exposed. Egyptian religion often appears elaborate from a distance, crowded with rituals and symbols and strange divine forms. Yet here the central fear becomes brutally simple. What if your life was unworthy of surviving? Outside the tomb, afternoon heat presses heavily across the desert while priests prepare another burial nearby. Their distant voices drift faintly through corridors carrying incense smoke into the still chamber. Inside, the dead wait for moral accounting. You accompany a priest named Kaimwaset through a funerary recitation later that evening. He chants portions of Spell 125 from memory, while mourners sit beside oil lamps listening with exhausted concentration. The deceased declares innocence before divine judges. I've not stolen. I've not murdered. I've not caused hunger. I've not cheated in weights and measures. I've not harmed the weak. The declarations continue carefully, almost rhythmically. The moral world revealed here feels surprisingly grounded. Egyptians cared deeply about ritual purity and divine order. Yes, but daily ethical behaviour matters too. Fairness matters. Restraint matters. Kindness matters. Not perfectly, of course. Egypt remains unequal and often harsh. Slavery exists. Punishments can be brutal. Political violence shadows dynastic struggles constantly. Yet morally, the civilization still imagines goodness through social balance rather than domination alone. Matt again. Always balance. You ask Kaimwaset whether people truly believe every heart tells the truth. He smiles faintly beneath torchlight as, your own heart knows things your mouth hides. The answer unsettles you slightly, because even now, thousands of years later, the idea feels uncomfortably recognizable. One afternoon during flood season, you sit beside a widow preparing offerings for her dead husband. Rain clouds never gather here the way they do in other lands, yet moisture hangs thickly over the Nile today. Flies drift lazily near the riverbank while she arranges bread and figs onto a low table before his memorial stela. She speaks to him softly while working. Complaints mostly. Their son drinks too much beer now. The roof leaks during cooler months. Prices rise unfairly at the market. Daily frustrations continue after death. and somehow that continuity comforts her. Then she pauses. "I hope his heart was light," she says quietly. "Not perfectly light. The distinction matters. Egyptian morality does not demand impossible purity." Human beings remain complicated inside these beliefs. Tomb autobiographies often portray officials describing generosity, honesty, and fairness, yet many sound offensive too. People worry about judgment precisely because they understand their own imperfections. One wealthy administrator commissions a funerary inscription emphasizing how kindly he treated workers during famine years. The sculptor carving the text later mutters privately that the man underpaid half the region. Even ancient propaganda survives. Still, perhaps the administrator's anxiety reveals something meaningful. He wants history to remember him morally, not merely powerfully. Reputation becomes spiritual currency. You walk through an acropolis at dusk where painted tomb walls depict judgment scenes, again and again beneath fading light. Some are grand and intricate, others simple and hurried, yet the scales appear almost everywhere. Human beings crave fairness after death, especially in societies where fairness during life remains uncertain. One young labourer confesses quietly over a late meal that he fears the judgment because he once stole grain during a poor harvest season. His companions tease him gently. "You stole grain from temple stores," one says. "The gods probably admired your courage." Laughter follows, but not entirely. Moral ambiguity lives comfortably beside sacred fear in Egypt. People bargain emotionally with their own conscience constantly. Priests offer guidance. Rituals offer reassurance. Yet no clear agreement survives regarding exactly how divine judgment functions beyond death. Accounts differ. Some emphasize ritual knowledge, others ethical conduct. Most combine both. You spend time inside a workshop where funerary amulets are crafted for placement over the heart during burial. Scarab-shaped heart amulets carry inscriptions begging the heart itself not to betray the deceased during judgment. "Do not stand against me as witness. Do not speak falsely against me." The request feels almost painfully human. People fear exposure, not only by gods, by themselves. One craftsman polishing a heart's scarab explains that many clients specifically request extra protective inscriptions now. Anxiety about judgment seems to grow alongside expanding access to afterlife beliefs. Once only kings worried about eternity, he says. Now everyone does. The democratization of salvation brings democratization of fear too. That evening you attend another burial ceremony west of the Nile beneath a sky crowded with cold stars. The mourners look exhausted after weeks of preparation and ritual obligations. Sand moves softly against sandals as priests complete final prayers beside the sealed tomb entrance. A little girl asks her grandmother whether bad people always lose their hearts. The old woman thinks carefully before answering. "I think people become lighter when they are loved properly." The response contains no official theology, yet somehow it feels emotionally truer than many formal doctrines. Because throughout Egypt, love and memory constantly intertwine with morality itself. To care for family, to feed the hungry, to avoid cruelty, to maintain harmony within the community. These actions preserve Ma'at as much as temple rituals ever do. Night deepens slowly across the necropolis now. Inside sealed tombs, painted hearts wait eternally upon scales beneath the watchful eyes of gods. Outside, living people continue wrestling quietly with guilt, kindness, regret, pride, and the ordinary failures shaping every human life. And somewhere beyond those painted chambers, the dead still hope their hearts remember them gently. The queen sits perfectly still while servants fasten gold jewellery around her wrists. Morning light filters through linen curtains, softening the edges of the chamber while incense burns nearby with a faint, sweet smell that clings to the air. Outside the palace walls, Memphis already hums with movement. Officials hurry through courtyards carrying sealed documents. Stable workers calm restless horses. Temple bells sound faintly across the city. Inside, however, everything slows around her. Royal women in Egypt live surrounded by tension and isolation at once. You watch the queen study herself briefly in a polished copper mirror before handing it away without comment. Her face remains composed, though exhaustion shadows her eyes faintly beneath carefully applied cosmetics. A servant adjusts the pleated linen at her shoulders, while another braids scented flowers into her hair. Every gesture here carries political meaning. Queens are not merely wives. They are symbols of continuity, fertility, divine legitimacy, and dynastic survival. And beneath all that ceremony, they remain human beings expected to endure impossible pressure gracefully. You accompany the royal procession toward a temple ceremony honouring Hathor. Sunlight flashes sharply across gold collars and polished chariot fittings. Crowds kneel as the queen passes through the streets. Though many ordinary people glimpse her only briefly between guards and attendants, to them she seems almost divine. To herself, perhaps less so. One elderly palace servant whispers quietly while adjusting ceremonial fabrics. People think luxury cures loneliness. Then she laughs softly without humour. The palace smells of perfume oils, heated stone, candle smoke, and fresh papyrus. Courtyards bloom with lotus pools and carefully cultivated gardens. Musicians rehearse constantly somewhere beyond carved walls. Yet tension lives here too, hidden beneath ritual elegance. Royal women navigate dangerous emotional terrain. A queen who produces heirs gains influence. A queen who fails may vanish quietly from prominence. Dynastic politics shape intimacy itself. You spend time among palace attendants who speak cautiously when discussing royal marriages. Alliances matter, bloodlines matter, religious symbolism matters. Love occasionally appears, but rarely without complication. Pharaohs sometimes marry sisters or daughters to preserve divine lineage. Foreign princesses arrive through diplomatic negotiations carrying homesickness hidden beneath formal dignity. One young attendant from Nubia admits she still dreams about the smell of rain in her childhood village. It almost never rains here, she says while arranging cosmetics beside a royal bedchamber. I miss storms. The remark lingers strangely inside all this controlled grandeur. Queens possess real authority at times. Some advise pharaohs directly. Others manage estates, temples, and political networks. Several act as regents for young sons. A few rule independently with remarkable skill. Yet even powerful royal women remain trapped inside constant visibility. Their bodies become state concerns. Their fertility becomes national anxiety. You witness this pressure most painfully during childbirth rituals within the palace. Midwives move urgently through hot chambers thick with incense and sweat, while priests whisper protective prayers outside. Childbirth remains terrifyingly dangerous regardless of status. Wealth softens discomfort somewhat, but cannot fully protect against hemorrhage, infection, or death. One queen grips a servant's hand so tightly during labour that both hands bruise afterward. No monument records that detail. History often forgets physical pain endured by women entirely. When healthy children survive, relief floods the palace almost visibly. Musicians play louder, servants smile more freely, officials move with renewed confidence. Dynasties continue through fragile infant lungs drawing breath, successfully through the night. You walk later through royal burial chambers prepared for queens and princesses west of the Nile. Their tombs contain exquisite jewellery, cosmetics, mirrors, clothing, musical instruments, and household objects crafted with extraordinary care. Again, the afterlife remains deeply personal. One painted scene shows a queen seated beside her children beneath flowering trees while musicians play nearby. Another depicts women exchanging perfume cones during a banquet. The emotional atmosphere differs subtly from many male tombs emphasizing status and administration. These spaces preserve intimacy. You notice letters stored among palace archives too, some formal, some unexpectedly tender. One king writes anxiously to a foreign ruler requesting medicine for his wife's illness. Another queen complains about delayed shipments of luxury oils with unmistakable irritation. Royalty rarely sounds legendary in correspondence. Mostly exhausted. Mostly human. At dusk you attend a palace feast celebrating a religious festival. Harp music drifts through torchlit halls while servants circulate carrying roasted duck, figs, wine, and honey cakes. Perfume oils warm against skin beneath crowded heat. Laughter rises unevenly across the room. The queen smiles continuously tonight. Too continuously, as you realize suddenly how exhausting ceremonial happiness must become. Every expression observed, every silence interpreted politically, every friendship carrying possible consequence. One older court musician leans toward you quietly during a performance. The servants know when queens cry. She says, "The walls don't..." Then she returns calmly to playing. Among the most remarkable royal women, figures like Hatshepsut gradually emerge from history's haze. A queen who eventually rules as Pharaoh herself, adopting kingly imagery and authority in ways both brilliant and controversial. Statues depict her wearing the ceremonial false beard of kingship while inscriptions defend her legitimacy carefully. Power always demands performance, especially from women claiming authority within systems built primarily for men. Some later rulers attempt erasing her memory after death. Statues damaged, names removed, images altered. Historians still debate motives fully. Political rivalry, perhaps. Dynastic insecurity, certainly. Again, the same ancient terror surfaces. Erasure. To destroy someone's name threatens more than reputation in Egypt. It threatens eternal survival itself. You imagine the emotional violence of such deliberate forgetting. One evening near the royal necropolis, you encounter women preparing funerary offerings for a dead princess buried young. The atmosphere feels painfully quiet. No grand political speeches now, only grieving relatives arranging flowers beside a sealed tomb while desert wind moves gently across the sand. A nurse who cared for the girl since infancy places a carved toy beside the offerings. She hated sleeping alone, the woman whispers. The simplicity of the statement cuts deeper than royal titles ever could. Because beneath the gold, the processions, the sacred authority, and the impossible expectations, queens and princesses still love children, fear illness, endure loneliness, and mourn their dead exactly like ordinary people beside the Nile. Night settles slowly across the palace and necropolis alike. Oil lamps flicker behind carved stone windows while distant temple music drifts through cooling air. Somewhere inside royal chambers, a queen removes heavy jewellery at last after another exhausting day of performance, and somewhere beneath the western desert, generations of royal women sleep beside mirrors, letters, perfumes, and names written carefully against forgetting. The city rises from the desert almost too suddenly. One day you travel beside familiar temple roads lined with old gods whose faces have watched Egypt for centuries. Then, farther east beneath a hard white sky, an entirely new capital appears where almost nothing ancient feels secure anymore. Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten, built by Pharaoh Akhenaten with astonishing speed and unsettling conviction. The city still smells new. Fresh plaster dries beneath sunlight. Stone dust hangs constantly in the air. Workers hurry through unfinished courtyards while officials unpack statues, furniture, scrolls, and sacred objects relocated from older temple centers. Everywhere you look, walls blaze with sunlight imagery. Long rays descend from a glowing solar disk ending in tiny human hands offering life directly to the royal family. The old gods disappear here, or rather they are being pushed away deliberately. You feel the tension immediately. Priests speak more carefully. Merchants whisper before mentioning traditional deities aloud. Some workers still carry hidden amulets beneath clothing despite official disapproval. Egypt has experienced political upheaval before. But this feels stranger. More personal. Akhenaten does not merely reform religion. He seems to reject the emotional structure Egypt has relied upon for centuries. You first see the pharaoh during a public ceremony beneath blazing noon light. His appearance startles you. Statues and reliefs portray him with elongated features, narrow limbs, rounded hips, and heavy facial lines unlike traditional idealized royal imagery. Historians still debate whether these depictions reflect medical conditions, artistic choices, symbolic intentions, or deliberate stylistic revolution. No clear agreement survives. What remains undeniable is the atmosphere surrounding him. Intense, restless, almost feverishly devoted. Beside him stands Queen Nefertiti, elegant and composed beneath the burning sun, while priests raise hymns to the Aten, the visible solar disk now elevated above older gods. Music echoes sharply across open courtyards, designed intentionally for sunlight rather than shadowed temple mystery. Traditional Egyptian religion often embraces darkness, hidden sanctuaries, incense-filled chambers. Akhenaten tears those spaces open toward the sky. You walk through temple complexes lacking roofs entirely, so sunlight floods sacred altars directly. The heat becomes unbearable by midday. Worshippers squint painfully while priests chant beneath relentless brightness. One elderly labourer mutters privately that the old gods at least provided shade. You almost laugh, then realise he's not entirely joking. The emotional disruption spreads far beyond theology. For centuries, Egyptians relied upon familiar divine relationships. Isis mourned, Osiris judged. Anubis guided the dead. Rituals surrounding death connected ordinary people to cosmic continuity. Now, many traditional practices suddenly feel politically dangerous or spiritually uncertain. Families become anxious, especially about burial customs. You spend time with scribes ordered to remove references to Amun and other traditional gods from official inscriptions. Chisels scrape across stone names with harsh repetitive sounds. Dust gathers at workers' feet while damaged hieroglyphs stare back like wounded faces. One scribe pauses during the work. "It feels wrong," he whispers. Not rebellious exactly, more like grief, because erasing gods also erases memories attached to them. Childhood prayers, funeral rituals, household traditions, entire emotional worlds built across generations. Akhenaten appears genuinely convinced he is restoring spiritual truth rather than causing harm. That may be what makes the transformation so unsettling. Fanaticism often arrives wearing sincerity. You attend a royal ceremony where the pharaoh speaks passionately about divine light reaching humanity directly through the Aten alone. The atmosphere feels almost hypnotic beneath blazing sunlight. Courtiers nod carefully. Priests praise loudly. Musicians play repetitive hymns rising into hot air shimmering above stone floors. And yet many faces around you look exhausted rather than inspired. Religious revolution demands emotional energy ordinary people rarely possess in abundance. Most Egyptians still worry primarily about harvests, illnesses, childbirth, taxes, aging parents, and proper burial rites. Abstract theological purity matters less than continuity. You notice quiet resistance everywhere now. Hidden household shrines, secret prayers whispered before sleep, tiny amulets concealed beneath linen clothing. One woman tells you privately that she still speaks to Isis each night while pretending publicly to honour only the Aten. Isis listens better, she says simply. The remark carries no political theory, only longing. Meanwhile, Akhenaten itself remains strangely beautiful. Broad avenues cut through the desert beneath endless open sky. Palaces display vivid painted floors filled with birds, flowers, and river scenes. Royal family portraits appear unusually intimate compared to older Egyptian art. Akhenaten and Nefertiti kiss their daughters openly. Children sit upon royal laps beneath sunlight rays ending in tiny blessing hands. The imagery feels startlingly human, almost vulnerable. Perhaps that vulnerability partly explains the era's fascination. The royal family seems emotionally visible in ways earlier dynasties rarely allowed themselves to appear, and yet fragility hangs over everything. You walk through residential districts where relocated officials complain quietly about the city's harsh climate and unfinished infrastructure. Dust invades homes constantly. Water management remains difficult. Some servants grow homesick for older cities filled with established temples and shaded streets. A cook curses softly while sweeping sand from a kitchen floor for the third time before noon. The Aten never stops throwing the desert inside, she mutters. Again, that ordinary human irritation grounding monumental history. One evening you stand overlooking the city during sunset while golden light floods the cliffs surrounding Akhenaten. The beauty feels almost overwhelming for a moment. Priests sing evening hymns while smoke from cooking fires drifts upward through cooling air. Then silence settles gradually. And beneath the beauty, uncertainty returns. What happens when one ruler reshapes spiritual life too quickly? What happens to ordinary mourners whose understanding of death depended upon older gods now condemned or neglected? The answers emerge slowly after Akhenaten's death. Very slowly. Officials begin restoring traditional worship almost immediately. The old gods return because emotionally they never fully disappeared. Temples reopen. Names of older deities reappear publicly. Akhenaten itself gradually empties beneath drifting desert sand. A revolutionary city abandoned within generations. You walk its quieter streets afterward, where wind moves through abandoned courtyards, carrying fine dust across fading painted walls. Cracked sunlight symbols stare upward toward the same sky that once seemed capable of replacing all older beliefs. History feels strangely sad here. Not because Akhenaten entirely failed, but because human beings rarely surrender familiar emotional anchors willingly. Egypt's older gods endured because they understood grief, fear, love, and death in ways ordinary people recognized instinctively, and no amount of sunlight alone could replace that intimacy. The boy king lies surrounded by gold, even now, before history transforms him into a global obsession. The burial chamber glows with impossible richness beneath flickering lamplight. Gold leaf catches every movement of flame. Painted walls shimmer with deep blues and reds. Resin perfumes the air heavily enough to taste, and at the center of it all rests Tutankhamun, young, fragile, dead before reaching full adulthood. You arrive in Thebes during the uneasy years following Akhenaten's religious revolution. The old gods return cautiously at first, then with increasing confidence. Temple workers repair damaged shrines. Priests resume familiar rituals abandoned only briefly. The atmosphere feels less triumphant than relieved. Egypt exhales slowly. People want continuity back. Tutankhamun becomes part of that restoration almost immediately. Born during chaos, raised amid shifting beliefs, he ascends the throne while still a child. Older advisors surround him constantly. Courtiers guide decisions. Priests reclaim influence carefully through ceremonial tradition. The king himself remains difficult to fully know. Historians still debate aspects of his health, personality, and political awareness. Surviving evidence suggests physical weakness. One foot possibly malformed, walking sticks buried beside him in astonishing numbers. His face in surviving portraits carries softness rather than commanding authority. A teenager beneath enormous expectations. You walk through palace corridors where servants speak quietly about the king's exhaustion after public ceremonies. One physician prepares herbal remedies beside open windows while flies drift lazily through hot afternoon air. Nearby musicians rehearse for temple festivals celebrating restored devotion to Amun. Everything now emphasizes return. Balance restored, tradition repaired, yet underneath official confidence, vulnerability remains obvious. The dynasty itself feels unstable after Akhenaten's disruptions. Court factions maneuver carefully around the young ruler. Foreign powers test Egypt's strength abroad. Priests and military officials compete subtly for influence. And somewhere inside all this, a boy grows older under constant observation. You spend one evening near the royal gardens while Tutankhamun rides slowly in a small chariot beneath fading sunlight. Attendants remain close. His movements appear slightly stiff. He laughs briefly at something one companion says, and for a moment the sacred performance falls away entirely. He simply looks young, too young. The tragedy becomes sharper because of that ordinary humanity. You notice how intensely palace officials manage appearances around him. Ceremonies emphasize divine legitimacy constantly. Statues depict strength and sacred authority. Public ritual compensates for private fragility. Power often behaves this way. The weaker it feels internally, the more magnificently it performs certainty. Then death arrives suddenly. Accounts differ regarding the exact cause. Infection, perhaps? Injury? Illness complicated by existing health problems. Historians continue debating possibilities thousands of years later. No clear agreement survives. Only the undeniable fact that the king dies around 19 years old. The atmosphere inside Thebes changes almost overnight. You feel it in the silence first. Temple bells sound slower somehow. Courtiers walk through palace halls with careful expressions, concealing panic beneath ritual composure. Servants whisper constantly now. The question hanging over everything remains dangerously simple. Who comes next? But before politics fully takes hold, mourning begins. And Egyptians understand mourning deeply. You enter the workshops preparing Tutankhamun's burial, while embalmers and craftsmen work with exhausting urgency. The king's tomb appears smaller than expected for a pharaoh. Perhaps because his death arrives too unexpectedly for grander preparations. Objects originally intended for others may have been repurposed quickly. Still, the scale remains astonishing. Gold masks, jewellery, chariots, furniture, weapons, board games, perfume oils, food offering, everything a king might require beyond death. The workshops smell of cedarwood, resin, molten gold, sweat, and lamp smoke. Artisans labour late into the night beneath flickering light while scribes label funerary goods carefully. One goldsmith, polishing ceremonial ornaments, mutters that the dead king will possess finer furniture than anyone alive in Egypt. No one contradicts him. The famous funerary mask rests nearby during part of the preparation process, its calm golden face illuminated softly beneath oil lamps. Lapis lazuli lines the eyes and brows. The expression appears serene, almost impossibly composed, yet beneath the mask waits a dead teenager. That contrast lingers painfully. You speak briefly with an older embalmer who worked previously on noble burials. Royal grief feels quieter, he says while arranging linen carefully. Ordinary families scream more. The observation surprises you. Then you realize palace mourning must remain controlled because political stability depends upon it. Public panic helps no dynasty survive succession uncertainty. Still, sorrow surfaces in smaller moments. A young servant who attended the king since childhood breaks down unexpectedly while carrying folded linens toward the burial chamber. Another palace official pauses too long beside one of Tutankhamun's walking sticks before turning away silently. Human attachment survives beneath ceremony. The burial itself unfolds with solemn precision. Priests chant beneath drifting incense while torchlight flickers against painted walls, depicting divine protection and rebirth. The opening of the mouth ritual restores the king symbolically for eternity. Sacred words surround him against darkness. And then the tomb seals, quietly, almost modestly compared to the enormous pyramids of earlier ages. No one present imagines this burial will someday become the most famous ancient Egyptian tomb ever discovered, largely because thieves fail to plunder it completely. History often depends upon accidents. Centuries pass. Empires rise and collapse. Sand drifts across forgotten entrances while Tutankhamun sleeps beneath layers of linen, gold, resin, and silence. Then, in the modern world, Excavators reopen the tomb beneath electric light and global fascination erupts instantly. Newspapers obsess over treasures glittering untouched after millennia. Rumours of curses spread through crowded cities far from the Nile. But standing here now in ancient Egypt, none of that future spectacle exists yet. Only grief, only ritual, only exhausted craftsmen placing final objects carefully beside a young king whose life ended before certainty ever truly arrived. Night settles across the Valley of the Kings, while cool desert wind moves softly between dark cliffs. Somewhere below those silent hills rests Tutankhamun beneath layers of gold meant to preserve memory forever. And somehow, against impossible odds, they eventually will. The soldiers leave before dawn. You hear the army long before you see it clearly. Sandals strike packed earth in dull rhythms, while horses snort clouds into the cool morning air. Bronze fittings clink softly against leather harnesses. Somewhere farther back, wagon wheels creak beneath supplies stacked for journeys lasting months or years. The Nile Valley still sleeps beneath blue darkness as the columns begin moving north. War has become ordinary now. Egypt stretches beyond its riverbanks during the New Kingdom period, projecting power deep into Nubia and the Near East. Pharaohs no longer defend borders alone. They pursue tribute, trade routes, prestige, and imperial control. Military victories decorate temple walls beside sacred imagery. Kings pose triumphantly above defeated enemies with practiced confidence. Yet beneath the monuments, war still smells like sweat, mud, blood, and wet leather. You travel beside soldiers marching toward foreign campaigns under banners snapping faintly in desert wind. Some men appear eager, others exhausted before battle even begins. Most are painfully young. One recruit admits quietly while tightening sandal straps that he's never travelled further than the next village south. Now he marches toward lands he cannot imagine. The army carries Egypt outward physically, but emotionally the Nile never fully releases them. Soldiers speak constantly about home, about wives waiting beside irrigation canals, about children learning to fish, about bread tasting different away from the river. Empire expands through homesick people. You reach a military encampment near the Levantine frontier after weeks of travel. The air here feels unfamiliar compared to Egypt. Cooler nights, different winds, foreign languages drifting through crowded markets. Campfires fill the darkness with smoke and roasting meat, while scribes record supplies beneath flickering torchlight. War turns administration portable. You sit beside a veteran sharpening bronze blades carefully against stone. Scars cross both forearms, pale beneath firelight. He speaks about earlier campaigns almost reluctantly. The temples show victories, he says. They do not show fever. Then, after a pause, "Or horses screaming after battle." The honesty cuts through royal propaganda instantly. Egyptian military success depends upon discipline and organisation as much as battlefield courage. Chariots thunder across plains with terrifying speed. Archers train relentlessly. Officers coordinate supply systems astonishing for the era. Victorious pharaohs commission huge relief carvings showing enemies crushed beneath divine power, but ordinary soldiers endure the physical reality underneath those images. Blisters, infections, cold nights far from home. You witness battle only briefly one afternoon beneath choking dust and unbearable noise. Chariots race across open ground while arrows darken portions of the sky. Horses panic. Men shout commands in multiple languages simultaneously. Bronze flashes violently in sunlight. Then confusion swallows everything. History later compresses battles into neat narratives with clear turning points and glorious outcomes. Living through combat feels messier, harder to interpret. A soldier beside you vomits afterward without embarrassment. Another sits silently staring at blood drying along his hands. Triumph and trauma arrive together. News of victories travels back toward Egypt through official inscriptions emphasizing divine favor and royal heroism. Temple walls eventually display idealized scenes where pharaohs dominate enemies effortlessly before approving gods. Yet letters survive too. Smaller voices. One soldier writes home asking whether floodwaters reach the farm successfully. Another begs relatives to maintain offerings for his dead brother buried far from Egypt. A third complains constantly about foreign beer. Human beings remain stubbornly ordinary inside empire. You return eventually to Thebes, where military wealth transforms the city visibly. Temples expand enormously through foreign tribute. Gold from Nubia pours into royal projects. Priests grow influential through state patronage. Markets fill with imported goods, strange perfumes, unfamiliar animals, and stories from distant territories. Empire enriches Egypt, and exhausts it slowly too. You spend time among women waiting for husbands serving abroad. Their lives become rhythms of uncertainty measured through delayed letters and temple prayers. One mother visits a shrine to Amun weekly, carrying tiny offerings for her son stationed near Syria. He hated cold weather, she says softly. You wonder whether he survives at all. No one can tell her yet. The emotional cost of empire spreads unevenly across society. Victorious kings gain prestige, temples gain wealth, merchants gain opportunity. But ordinary families absorb long absences, injuries, grief, and fear quietly. One evening during a festival honouring returning soldiers, musicians play loudly through crowded streets while wine flows generously beneath torchlight. Veterans dance awkwardly beside cheering relatives. Children stare wide-eyed at foreign trophies and military decorations. Then you notice one woman standing motionless near the edge of the crowd. Her husband's unit returned. He did not. Celebration becomes painful for her almost instantly. Ancient Egypt rarely separates glory from mourning completely. You accompany funeral processions for fallen soldiers buried west of the Nile with military honours and protective rituals. Priests invoke familiar gods beside coffins carried through dry wind beneath fading sunlight. Families place weapons, amulets, and letters inside tombs. One father touches his dead son's shield before burial. He was afraid of boats as a child, he whispers. The statement feels absurdly intimate against all the grand military symbolism surrounding them, and perhaps that intimacy matters most, because war always threatens individuality. States transform people into numbers, units, victories, casualties. Families fight quietly against that reduction through memory. He hated boats. He laughed too loudly. He loved figs dipped in honey. He feared thunderstorms. The dead survive through details. Meanwhile, pharaohs continue commissioning monumental records of conquest. Ramses II especially fills temples with scenes celebrating military achievement, including the famous Battle of Kadesh. Historians still debate aspects of the battle's outcome despite royal claims of overwhelming victory. Accounts differ. Propaganda survives aggressively. Reality less so. You stand beneath massive relief carvings showing Ramses towering heroically above enemy forces, while priests burn incense nearby. Tourists from across the empire admire the images with awe. The king appears invincible. Outside the temple complex, an old veteran limps slowly through the market, struggling with chronic pain probably earned during those same campaigns. Empires rarely preserve both versions equally. Night settles over the Nile again. Temple walls glow beneath torchlight, while distant drums echo through warm air carrying traces of incense and river moisture. Somewhere beyond Egypt's borders, soldiers still march beneath unfamiliar stars dreaming of home, and somewhere west of the river, beneath painted tomb ceilings and drifting desert sand, the dead of empire rest beside prayers hoping the gods guide them safely through darkness. The tomb robber pauses to listen. Nothing! Only wind moving softly through the valley outside and the distant scrape of sandals against stone somewhere deeper underground. Sweat runs slowly down his neck despite the cool night air trapped beneath the cliffs. His hands smell of dust, old rope, and fear. He knows the dead are watching, or at least part of him believes they might be. You stand beside him in the Valley of the Kings during an age when Egypt no longer feels invincible. Dynasties weaken. Officials steal from officials. Grain prices rise painfully. Labourers complain openly about delayed wages. The empire still possesses monuments large enough to humble entire civilizations. Yet beneath that grandeur, cracks spread quietly through daily life. And eventually, hungry people begin entering tombs, not because they hate the dead, because they need bread. The irony cuts deeply. For centuries, Egyptians built elaborate funerary systems designed to preserve eternity itself. Kings fill hidden chambers with gold, jewellery, sacred furniture, chariots, oils, statues, and protective texts. Priests seal entrances carefully against intrusion. Then economic hardship arrives, carrying ordinary desperation. A starving man sees treasure differently than a priest does. You travel first through the workers' village at Deir el-Medina, where skilled artisans once crafted royal tombs with astonishing precision. The settlement still hums with activity, but tension lingers everywhere now. Men argue over ration shortages. Wives complain about missing grain deliveries. Officials promise payment soon too often. One craftsman laughs bitterly while repairing tools beside his doorway. The pharaoh reaches eternity. He says, "My children reach hunger." The remark would once have sounded dangerously rebellious. Now several neighbours nod agreement. These workers know the royal tombs intimately. They designed corridors, painted chambers, hidden passages. They understand where valuables rest and how security systems function under stable conditions. Religious fear and social loyalty help protect the necropolis. But stability weakens, and hunger speaks loudly. You sit beside a group of labourers one evening while cooking fires flicker against mud brick walls. The smell of lentils and smoke hangs heavily in cooling air. Conversation drifts uneasily toward rumours of tomb robberies farther west. Nobody sounds shocked, only anxious. One older man mutters that the dead kings probably own enough gold already. Another crosses himself instinctively against bad luck. Even desperation does not fully erase fear of divine punishment. You begin hearing stories about gangs moving through the necropolis at night, carrying chisels wrapped in cloth to muffle sound. Some tunnel through rock walls, others bribe guards or collaborate with corrupt officials. Tomb robbery becomes organised gradually, almost bureaucratic in its own grim way. Ancient crime develops paperwork eventually. Trials survive from later investigations into these thefts. Testimonies describe stolen gold stripped from mummies, sacred objects melted down, coffins dismantled for valuables hidden within layers of linen and resin. The details feel horrifyingly intimate. One robber confesses to cutting jewellery directly from a dead queen's body. Another describes breaking open nested coffins while torch smoke filled the burial chamber. You imagine the silence inside those tombs after centuries untouched. Then suddenly footsteps, breathing, metal tools scraping against sacred wood. The violation feels emotional as much as criminal. Because Egyptian burial customs depend upon continuity between living and dead, tombs are not abandoned storage rooms. They remain active spiritual homes sustained through ritual memory. Robbing them threatens more than property. It threatens identity. You accompany local officials investigating one desecrated tomb after dawn. Sand still shows fresh footprints near the entrance. Inside, the air smells of broken resin, disturbed dust, and extinguished torches. Fragments of linen scatter across the floor beside smashed containers once holding oils and offerings. The mummy itself lies partially unwrapped. One investigator turns away visibly shaken, even after centuries of elaborate funerary practice. Seeing the dead treated violently still unsettles people deeply. A priest quietly begins reciting prayers almost automatically while workers examine the damage. You notice something heartbreaking near the burial chamber wall. A small wooden figure overlooked by thieves, a servant model carrying bread eternally toward the dead, worthless to robbers, precious to mourners. Outside the tomb, the valley glows pale beneath rising sunlight. Cliffs tower overhead with indifferent majesty while officials discuss suspects, missing valuables, and possible conspiracies. Some guards likely participated, some priests too, perhaps. Corruption spreads easily through weakened systems. Empires rarely collapse cleanly. They erode morally first. You spend time reading surviving legal records concerning tomb robberies. The testimonies feel startlingly human. Robbers describe fear, greed, hunger, regret. One insists repeatedly that his children were starving. Another claims drunken companions pressured him into participation. Some seem hardened, others sound ashamed. Punishments become severe. Beatings, mutilation, execution. The state understands these crimes threaten ideological foundations as much as wealth. If kings cannot protect their own tombs, what happens to faith in eternal order itself? And yet theft continues, because religious belief competes poorly against famine sometimes. One widow near Deir el Medina admits quietly that she purchased gold jewellery knowing it probably came from tomb robbers. "What was I supposed to do?" she asks. "My sons needed grain." No easy answer arrives. That complexity matters. History often prefers clear villains and heroes. Real suffering rarely organises itself so neatly. The robbers desecrate sacred spaces. They violate the dead. But many also emerge from the same exhausted labouring classes who built those tombs originally. People preserving eternity one generation. People dismantling it the next. You walk through portions of the Valley of the Kings at night while cold desert wind moves between dark cliffs. Somewhere beneath your feet lie rulers once convinced their hidden burials guaranteed permanence forever. Yet even secrecy fails eventually. Perhaps especially secrecy. One old guard speaks softly beside a torchlit entrance sealed after recent repairs. "The dead should have stayed closer to the living," he says. The statement lingers afterward. Because ordinary village graves often survive emotionally better than royal tombs packed with treasure. Families visit them, maintain them, speak names aloud regularly. The relationship remains personal rather than monumental. But kings surround themselves with wealth and isolation invites intrusion once fear weakens. Dawn approaches slowly over the valley now. Pale light touches cliff edges while jackals move quietly across the desert floor, searching for scraps left behind by the living. Somewhere beneath the sand, damaged coffins and violated mummies still wait in darkness beside prayers meant to protect them forever. And somewhere nearby, hungry people wake again wondering what remains worth stealing from eternity. The language changes slowly first. You hear it in crowded markets along the Nile where merchants now bargain in accents unfamiliar to older generations. Foreign soldiers patrol beside Egyptian guards. Greek traders unload amphorae near temples older than their entire civilization. Persian officials stamp documents beneath carved images of gods they barely understand. Egypt still stands, but Egypt no longer belongs entirely to Egyptians. The transition happens across centuries through conquest, diplomacy, rebellion, compromise and exhaustion. One empire arrives, then another. Persians rule, then Greeks under Alexander the Great. Later Rome stretches its authority southward along the river like an enormous shadow. Yet through all these changes, ordinary life continues stubbornly. Bread still bakes before dawn. Boats still drift through morning mist. Families still carry their dead westward beneath desert sunlight. You travel first during the Persian occupation where tension hangs quietly over temple cities. Egyptian priests perform rituals carefully while foreign administrators monitor taxes and political loyalty. Some Persians respect local traditions pragmatically. Others treat Egypt mainly as territory to extract wealth from. People adapt because survival requires adaptation. One elderly temple scribe shrugs while repairing damaged records. The river floods whether rulers speak Egyptian or not. The remark carries weary wisdom earned through watching dynasties vanish. Still, resentment simmers beneath daily routine. Rebellions flare periodically. National pride survives through religious continuity and cultural memory. Egyptian identity now feels partly defensive, preserved deliberately against outside control. Then Alexander arrives. Young, brilliant, restless. His conquest reshapes the Eastern Mediterranean almost unbelievably fast. Egyptians largely welcome him after Persian rule. Priests declare him legitimate pharaoh. He visits temples respectfully. Stories spread quickly about his charisma and ambition. Yet Alexander himself passes through Egypt like a storm rather than a permanent resident. The city that truly transforms the country afterward is Alexandria. You approach it by sea beneath sharp salt wind carrying scents of fish, tar, and distant spice markets. The city feels unlike older Egyptian settlements immediately. Broad avenues cut through crowded districts filled with Greek architecture. Libraries, theatres, scholars, sailors, mercenaries, priests, and traders from across the known world. Languages overlap everywhere. Greek increasingly dominates administration and elite culture. Egyptian traditions continue powerfully among the broader population. The result feels layered rather than fully replaced. Cultures overlap awkwardly like people sharing crowded rooms. You walk through the famous Library of Alexandria where scribes copy texts beneath high windows flooded with Mediterranean light. Papyrus rustles softly while philosophers debate astronomy, medicine, mathematics, poetry, and theology in nearby halls. Knowledge gathers here obsessively. One librarian jokes that Alexandria intends to collect every book ever written before humanity forgets how fragile paper becomes near water. Again, that familiar Egyptian fear, forgetting. The city fascinates because it combines preservation and transformation simultaneously. Egyptian funerary traditions survive, yet Greek artistic influences alter coffin portraits gradually. Temples continue functioning, though some gods merge symbolically across cultures. Serapis emerges blending Egyptian and Greek religious elements into something newly imperial. Identity becomes fluid. You spend time among embalmers still practicing mummification centuries after the pyramids first rose. The workshop smells familiar despite changing political eras. Resin, linen, smoke, salt. The techniques evolve somewhat, but the emotional logic remains deeply recognizable. Families still cannot bear losing one another completely. One embalmer laughs softly while discussing Greek customers requesting Egyptian burial customs. They mock us until someone dies, he says. Death equalizes cultural confidence quickly. You notice foreign rulers often adopt Egyptian symbolism strategically. Greek kings dress as pharaohs during temple rituals. Roman emperors later appear carved upon ancient walls making offerings to traditional gods despite governing from unimaginably distant capitals. Power adapts to emotional realities, and Egypt's religious traditions remain emotionally resilient because they address grief so intimately. Yet change continues relentlessly. Traditional hieroglyphic literacy declines gradually over centuries. Fewer people understand ancient temple inscriptions fully. Greek becomes dominant in intellectual and administrative life. Economic pressures reshape burial practices too. Grand tombs grow rarer for many families. Still, ordinary devotion survives stubbornly. You attend a funeral in Roman Egypt where mourners carry a mummified body wrapped partly in traditional linens, yet painted with strikingly realistic portraiture, influenced by Mediterranean artistic styles. The dead woman's face gazes outward with haunting individuality beneath wax pigments and gold leaf. Ancient beliefs wearing newer clothing. A little boy asks whether she will still find Osiris if the portrait looks Greek. His mother kisses his forehead gently. The dead recognize love better than styles, she says. The answer feels perfect somehow. Outside Alexandria. Older temple complexes begin declining slowly under changing political priorities. Some priests struggle financially. Sacred buildings weather centuries of neglect, earthquakes, theft, and repurposed stone removal. Yet rituals continue in reduced forms long after official support weakens. You visit one aging temple near dusk where only a handful of priests maintain ceremonies once requiring enormous staffs. Incense still burns. Hymns still echo softly through columns darkened by age, but portions of the roof have collapsed open toward the sky. One old priest sweeps sand from the sanctuary floor patiently. When gods grow quiet, he says, people stop listening carefully. Then, after a pause, or maybe people grow noisy. The sadness inside the remark feels immense, because civilizations rarely notice their own fading clearly while living through it. Change feels gradual day by day. A closed shrine here, a forgotten ritual there, a language fewer children bother learning. Then suddenly entire emotional worlds exist mostly in memory, and yet Egypt never entirely disappears. That becomes increasingly clear as you move through these overlapping centuries. Foreign rulers come seeking legitimacy through ancient traditions. Travellers arrive searching for wisdom from impossibly old monuments. Tombs still inspire awe. Mummies still provoke fascination and reverence. Even decline cannot fully erase the emotional gravity Egypt accumulated across millennia. Night settles over Alexandria now. Lighthouse fires burn against dark sea wind while ships drift quietly within the harbour. Somewhere beyond the city, westward beneath desert cliffs. Ancient tombs still hold mummies wrapped carefully against decay beside prayers written in languages fewer people understand each generation. But the dead remain, and the river still moves north through darkness carrying memory toward uncertain futures. The Queen arrives by barge at dusk. Purple sails catch the last Mediterranean light, while musicians play softly across the water and attendants burn incense that drifts behind the vessel in pale silver ribbons. The harbour crowds fall strangely quiet watching her approach. Even before you see her clearly, the atmosphere changes around her. Cleopatra understands performance better than almost anyone alive. Not shallow performance, political performance, emotional performance. The careful shaping of perception into power. You stand among merchants, sailors, soldiers, and curious locals along the Alexandrian harbour, while the Queen's barge glides inward through darkening water. Gold fittings reflect torchlight. Perfumed air mingles with sea salt and tar from nearby ships. Somewhere gulls scream above the noise. And there she is. Not the impossible seductress imagined later by distant storytellers, but a highly educated ruler carrying exhaustion beneath magnificent composure. Cleopatra speaks multiple languages fluently. She studies politics relentlessly. She understands Egypt, Greece, and Rome all at once because survival now requires navigating impossible worlds simultaneously. Egypt grows older. Rome grows hungrier. That imbalance shadows every decision she makes. Alexandria under Cleopatra still dazzles the senses. Libraries, palaces, temples, gardens, crowded markets, observatories, and harbours fill the city with movement from dawn until deep night. Philosophers argue beneath shaded colonnades. Sailors stagger drunkenly through torchlit streets. Priests continue rituals in temples older than memory, while Roman envoys calculate military alliances nearby. Civilizations overlap almost violently here. You walk through palace corridors smelling of perfume oils, candle smoke, papyrus, and sea air carried inland through open windows. Servants hurry quietly between chambers carrying maps, sealed correspondence, wine, and reports from distant territories. Cleopatra rarely appears idle. One exhausted secretary admits the Queen sometimes dictates letters while eating because there is no time left for separate activities anymore. Power consumes hours mercilessly. You attend a diplomatic gathering where Roman officials study Cleopatra with guarded fascination. Some admire her intelligence openly. Others distrust her immediately. Rome increasingly portrays powerful foreign queens as dangerous by definition, especially queens capable of influencing Roman men. Later propaganda will flatten Cleopatra into caricature because complexity threatens political narratives. Yet standing near her now, you sense something far more interesting than simple seduction. Calculation, loneliness, brilliance sharpened by constant pressure. She carries Egypt itself like a fragile object already beginning to crack. You accompany royal attendants preparing ceremonial appearances along the Nile. Cleopatra still presents herself as pharaoh within Egyptian contexts, participating in ancient rituals connecting her to Isis and traditional divine authority. Yet she governs through Greek dynastic traditions too. Identity becomes strategic. One palace servant jokes quietly that the queen changes cultural masks faster than musicians change songs during banquets. The servant means it admiringly, because adaptability keeps kingdoms alive. For a while, you witness Cleopatra with Julius Caesar first through the eyes of anxious Alexandrian officials. Rumours race through the palace constantly. Alliances shift. Civil conflict within Egypt collides dangerously with Roman power struggles. Cleopatra understands immediately that Rome can either preserve her throne temporarily or erase it entirely. There are no smaller stakes left. The famous stories later grow theatrical. Hidden carpets, seduction, scandal. Some details may contain truth. Others become embellished through generations of retelling by writers fascinated with powerful women and collapsing empires. But beneath legend sits a simpler reality. Two intensely ambitious people recognizing mutual usefulness. Perhaps more eventually, perhaps not always. History rarely grants emotional privacy to famous individuals. You spend time outside palace walls too, where ordinary Egyptians continue living through enormous geopolitical transformations with limited control over outcomes. Fishermen still repair nets beside muddy canals. Bakers still sweat through hot mornings. Mothers still carry sick children toward temples seeking healing. Empire shifts overhead while daily survival continues underneath. One elderly woman selling figs near the harbour shrugs when asked about Roman influence. Rulers change, she says. The river does not. Again, that Nile wisdom surviving every dynasty. Yet even ordinary people sense danger approaching now. Taxes rise. Military tensions intensify. Rumours spread constantly about Roman rivalries dragging Egypt toward catastrophe. Cleopatra's relationship with Mark Antony later deepens both politically and personally, binding Egypt's fate even more tightly to Roman civil wars. You encounter Antony during a military gathering near Alexandria. He radiates physical confidence worn rough around the edges by years of campaigning. Soldiers adore him partly because he behaves less carefully than polished Roman elites. Wine flows heavily around him, laughter too, but fatigue shadows him increasingly. All ages people unevenly, together. Antony and Cleopatra create something emotionally compelling enough that later generations struggle separating fact from mythology. They appear glamorous, doomed, excessive, passionate, perhaps because they are confronting impossible decline while pretending otherwise. The palace still hosts magnificent feasts beneath torchlight reflected across polished marble and gold vessels. Music drifts through warm night air carrying scents of wine, roasted meats, and sea wind. Guests laugh loudly. Poets recite flattering verses. Courtiers dance, and outside Rome tightens its grip steadily. You stand beside Cleopatra one evening overlooking Alexandria's harbour beneath cold stars. For a rare moment, no officials crowd around her. No ceremonies demand attention. Ships move quietly through black water far below. She was old before I was born, Cleopatra says softly about Egypt itself. The remark surprises you. Then she continues, people think ancient things feel stable. Mostly they feel tired. The honesty lands heavily, because by now Egypt carries thousands of years inside itself. Pyramids already ancient beyond comprehension, tombs looted and forgotten, gods changing names across centuries, languages fading, rituals surviving mostly through repetition, and still the civilization breathes somehow, until Rome finally arrives fully. The defeated Actium breaks remaining hopes gradually, Accounts differ regarding final conversations and private emotions afterward. Ancient historians contradict one another constantly, especially when discussing Cleopatra. Political bias distorts nearly every surviving source, but the ending remains unmistakable. Antony dies. Cleopatra eventually follows. The last pharaoh of ancient Egypt disappears into history, wrapped instantly by legend. You walk through quieter palace corridors afterward, where servants remove belongings with hollow-eyed exhaustion. Curtains move softly in sea wind through abandoned chambers. Somewhere distant, Roman soldiers shout orders across the city. An era ends not with dramatic music, but with tired people carrying objects through silent rooms. Night settles over Alexandria one final time. Lighthouse fires burn against dark Mediterranean water while beyond the city, beneath endless desert stars. Ancient tombs still hold their dead wrapped carefully beside prayers for eternal continuity. And now even the last kingdom joins them. The desert keeps its silence carefully. Even now, long after pharaohs vanish, long after temples collapse, long after languages fade from ordinary speech, the western cliffs beyond the Nile still glow red beneath sunset, exactly as they did when the first mourners carried loved ones into shallow graves thousands of years earlier. You stand alone beside ruined stone columns half buried in drifting sand, while evening wind moves softly through broken chambers once crowded with incense, prayers, and human certainty. The air smells faintly of dust warmed all day beneath the sun. Somewhere far away, a dog barks across the riverbank, then quiet returns. Ancient Egypt survives strangely, not as a kingdom, as a feeling. You sense it everywhere now. In museums where visitors lower their voices instinctively beside mummies resting behind glass. In archaeologists brushing sand carefully from painted coffins under unbearable heat. In children staring upward at pyramids with the same disbelief felt by travellers thousands of years ago. The dead continue attracting the living, perhaps because Egypt preserved mortality so honestly. You walk through a modern excavation camp near Saqqara, where electric lamps glow against canvas tents beneath cold desert stars. Archaeologists sit drinking bitter coffee after long days uncovering burial shafts hidden for centuries. Their clothes smell of dust, sweat, and sunscreen instead of incense and resin. Yet emotionally the work feels strangely continuous. One young archaeologist brushes sand from a coffin lid with almost reverent gentleness. "She had flowers painted here," he says quietly. "The flowers remain vivid after 2,000 years. Blue petals against faded gold. Someone once chose those colours lovingly." That realization never stops affecting people. Modern excavators often describe sudden emotional intimacy while opening tombs. A comb left beside a body. Sandals carefully placed for the journey ahead. Letters from grieving relatives. Tiny toys buried with children. Human tenderness preserved accidentally by dry desert air. History collapses inward during such moments. The distance between worlds shrinks. You enter a museum gallery late in the afternoon where visitors move slowly among mummies illuminated beneath soft controlled lighting. Some people appear fascinated, others uncomfortable. One little girl presses close to her father, whispering questions about whether the dead ever wake up lonely. The father hesitates, then answers softly. Maybe that's why they were buried with so many things. The old emotional logic still makes sense somehow. Ancient Egyptians spent thousands of years building defences against disappearance. They wrapped bodies, wrote names, painted walls, filled tombs with food, stories, furniture, music, prayers, and spells against darkness. And remarkably, much of it worked. Not exactly as they intended, perhaps, but they survived. Not biologically, culturally, emotionally. You think back now across everything you witnessed beside the Nile. The first villages beside floodwater, stone rising at Saqqara, workers hauling limestone beneath blistering sunlight, families mourning ordinary deaths, embalmers smoothing linen around still hands with heartbreaking tenderness. All of it connected. Ancient Egypt never obsessed with death because life meant little. Quite the opposite. They preserved the dead because life felt precious enough to continue. That distinction matters deeply. Too often, modern imagination reduces Egypt into spectacle. Golden masks, curses, treasure chambers, mysterious rituals beneath torchlight. Yet beneath all the grandeur lived ordinary people who loved one another fiercely and feared forgetting more than almost anything else. A mother worrying whether her husband would recognize her after death. A labourer joking through exhaustion beside unfinished pyramids. A widow still speaking aloud to a dead partner during morning meals. Human beings remain recognizable across 5,000 years. That may be the strangest feeling Egypt leaves behind. You travel one final evening along the Nile while twilight gathers softly across the water. Flukas drift quietly through purple light. Palm trees darken against the horizon. Somewhere nearby, modern Cairo hums with distant traffic and electric life while ancient ruins rest patiently beneath the same sky. Civilizations layer themselves here rather than fully disappearing. The river connects them all. You realize too that historians still debate countless details surrounding ancient Egypt. New discoveries constantly reshape understanding. Tombs remain unopened. Texts remain untranslated. Entire lives vanished without record. No clear agreement survives regarding many rulers, rituals, or events. And perhaps that uncertainty feels appropriate. The Egyptians themselves understood memory imperfectly. That is why they fought so hard against loss. Night settles gradually now. Stars emerge above the desert with the same cold clarity visible to embalmers. Priests, queens, soldiers, farmers, tomb robbers, and grieving families thousands of years ago. Wind moves softly across ancient stone worn smooth by time. The monuments remain astonishing, but eventually you understand the quieter things matter equally. The handwritten name on a funerary bowl, the repaired sandal buried beside a worker, the child's toy resting near a coffin, the final letter folded into linen wrappings. History survives through intimacy as much as grandeur. You stop near the edge of the western desert where darkness spreads outward across the necropolis. Somewhere beneath the sand lie millions of dead Egyptians, most unnamed now, each once believing the future might remember them if enough care surrounded their burial. In a strange way, the future did remember. Not individually perhaps, but collectively, their fears, hopes, rituals, griefs, humour, tenderness, and stubborn resistance against oblivion still reach across time into quiet rooms where tired listeners drift towards sleep beside the glow of distant screens. And maybe that is its own kind of afterlife. The Nile continues northward through darkness exactly as it always has. Water sliding past reeds, past villages, past temples and ruins and cities built atop older cities. Endless movement carrying memory forward while the desert watches silently from the west. You listen a while longer. Then finally, gently, you let ancient Egypt rest. For tonight, my friend. Thank you for walking beside the Nile through so many centuries of memory, grief, wonder, and human longing. Ancient Egypt can sometimes feel impossibly distant when reduced to monuments and museum glass. Yet the deeper you travel into its stories, the more familiar its people become. Parents worrying about children, workers laughing through exhaustion, lovers trying to outlast separation, entire generations searching for meaning in the face of death. Perhaps that is why these ruins continue pulling people back across time, not because the Egyptians escaped mortality, but because they looked directly at it and answered with care. Ritual, beauty, and remembrance. If this journey stayed with you tonight, I would genuinely love to hear where you listen from, what local time it is for you now, and which part of ancient Egypt lingered most in your thoughts. Sometimes the quiet conversations beneath these videos become their own kind of gathering place, filled with people awake together beneath very different skies. And if you would like to continue wandering through the ancient world another night, there are always more roads waiting, more forgotten kingdoms, more quiet lives buried beneath history's louder names, more candle smoke drifting through lost temples after dark. Until then, I hope sleep finds you gently. May your dreams be calm, your heart light, and your night peaceful beside the slow, eternal river.